The frozen mud cracked beneath Margaret Holloway's boots as she stared at the eviction notice nailed to her barn door. 60 days. That's all she had left before losing everything her dead husband left behind. A collapsing ranch, starving cattle, and debts that could drown 3 families. The widow had 2 choices: surrender to the vultures circling her land, or do something so desperate that Red Creek would talk about it for decades. She chose the unthinkable. She wrote to a stranger and offered him everything except her heart. But before this story ends, you'll discover that some gambles pay off in ways no one sees coming. If you're watching from somewhere out there in this big world, drop your city in the comments below. I want to see just how far Margaret's story travels. And hit that like button if you believe broken people can build something beautiful together. Now settle in, because this is going to be one hell of a ride. The winter of 1882 hit Nebraska like a punishment. Margaret Holloway stood in the doorway of her kitchen, wrapped in a wool shawl that had more holes than fabric, watching ice crystals form on the inside of her windows. Outside, the wind screamed across the prairie with nothing to stop it. No trees, no hills, just flat frozen land stretching toward a gray horizon that looked like the edge of the world. She was 34 years old. That wasn't old by most standards, but out here it felt ancient. Her hands were cracked and bleeding from work. Her face had lines that hadn't been there 2 years ago. And her eyes, well, her eyes had that hollow look people get when they've cried themselves empty and there's nothing left but dust. Thomas had been dead for 8 months. 8 months since the wagon wheel caught in a rut during the autumn haul. 8 months since the whole damn thing flipped sideways and crushed him before he could even yell. She'd found him an hour later, still pinned beneath 2,000 pounds of wood and cargo, his eyes open to the sky like he was surprised death had finally caught up with him. The funeral was small. Thomas hadn't been popular. He'd had a talent for rubbing people wrong, for picking fights over fence lines and water rights. But he'd been hers, and he'd been alive. And now he wasn't. What he'd left behind was a disaster. The Holloway Ranch sprawled across 200 acres of prairie that looked impressive on paper, but was mostly worthless scrubland. They'd had cattle once, 40 head of decent stock. Now she was down to 18, and half of those were so thin their ribs showed through their hides like prison bars. The barn roof leaked. The fences were falling apart. The house had a crack in the foundation that was slowly pulling the whole structure sideways. And the debts. Jesus, the debts. Thomas had borrowed money from the Red Creek Savings Bank to buy equipment they didn't need. He'd borrowed from neighbors to pay for feed they couldn't afford. He'd even borrowed from Sam Pritchard, the wealthiest rancher in the county, a man who smiled like a preacher but had the soul of a snake. Margaret had found the ledgers after the funeral, tucked in a drawer like shameful secrets. Numbers written in Thomas's messy handwriting, dates, amounts, promises he'd made that she now had to keep. $1,500. That's what she owed, total. It might as well have been $15,000. She'd tried everything. She'd sold their good horses and kept the old mare that was half lame. She'd sold Thomas's tools, his saddle, his rifle, everything that wasn't nailed down or necessary for basic survival. She'd taken sewing work from women in town, staying up until midnight stitching hems and mending tiers for pennies that barely bought flour. It wasn't enough. It was never going to be enough. 2 weeks ago, Charles Grayson from the bank had ridden out to the ranch wearing his city suit and his sympathetic smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Mrs. Holloway," he'd said, standing in her kitchen like he owned it already. "I understand your situation is difficult. Truly, I do. But the bank has obligations. We've been patient, but patience has limits." "I'm working on it," Margaret had said, hating how small her voice sounded. "I'm sure you are." Grayson had pulled out a pocket watch, checked it like he had somewhere better to be. "But working on it isn't the same as paying. You have 60 days, Mrs. Holloway, 2 months. After that, we'll have no choice but to foreclose." He'd left her standing there with that word hanging in the air like smoke. Foreclose. It meant losing everything. The land, the house, the cattle, all of it would go to auction. She'd be left with nothing, forced to move into town and live on charity or find work as someone's maid or cook. At 34, with no family and no prospects, that was as good as a death sentence. The neighbors were already circling. Sam Pritchard had visited twice, riding up on his expensive black stallion with 2 ranch hands trailing behind him like an entourage. He was a tall man in his 50s, silver-haired and handsome, in the way that rich men often are when they can afford good barbers and tailors. "Margaret," he'd said the first time, tipping his hat with exaggerated courtesy. "I heard about your troubles. Terrible thing, losing Thomas. Just terrible." She'd stood on her porch with her arms crossed, not inviting him inside. "What do you want, Sam?" Direct. "I always liked that about you." He'd smiled, showing white teeth. "I'm here to make you an offer. A generous one. I'll buy the ranch, land, house, cattle, everything. I'll pay off your debts and give you enough left over to start fresh somewhere else. Somewhere easier than this. The ranch isn't for sale. Margaret, be reasonable. I said it's not for sale." His smile had hardened at the edges. "Pride's an expensive luxury, Margaret. You can't eat it. Can't pay debts with it either. Think about my offer. Think hard." He'd ridden away, but she knew he'd be back. Men like Sam Pritchard didn't give up when they wanted something. They just waited for you to get desperate enough to surrender. The second visit had been worse. He'd brought papers that time, a contract already drawn up with numbers that looked reasonable until you realized he was offering half what the land was worth. "Last chance," he'd said, holding out the papers. "Sign now, and you walk away with your dignity intact. Wait for foreclosure, and you'll have nothing. Nothing, Margaret." She'd shut the door in his face. But that night, alone in the house with the wind howling outside, she'd cried until her chest ached. Because Sam was right about one thing. She was running out of options. That's when she'd thought of the letters. She'd read about them in a newspaper someone had left at the general store. Women back east writing to men out west. Men in mining camps and logging towns and railroad settlements, writing to women they'd never met. Arranging marriages through the mail like business transactions. The idea had seemed desperate and pathetic when she first saw it. Now it seemed like the only option left. Because here's the truth. Margaret had learned in 8 months of trying to run the ranch alone. One person couldn't do it. The work was too much. The days were too long. She needed help, real help, not the occasional charity from neighbors who mostly just wanted to watch her fail so they could say they'd predicted it. She needed a partner. Not a husband in the traditional sense. She didn't want love or romance or any of that nonsense. Thomas had been her husband, and look where that had gotten her. No, what she needed was a worker. Someone strong enough to handle the physical labor, smart enough to help with the business, and desperate enough to accept the arrangement. The letter had taken her 3 days to write. She'd gone through a dozen drafts, crumpling them up and throwing them in the fire when the words came out wrong. Too proud. Too desperate. Too pathetic. Finally, she'd settled on something direct. Widow, 34, seeks capable man for partnership marriage. Ranch in Nebraska needs immediate help. Hard work guaranteed. Romance not expected. Respond only if serious. She'd mailed it to a newspaper in St. Louis that ran a section for such correspondence. Then she'd waited, feeling sick with shame every time she thought about what she'd done. The neighbors would crucify her if they found out. Red Creek was a small town, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business and judged it over coffee and church pews. A woman advertising for a husband like she was selling livestock? They'd never let her forget it. But Margaret was past caring about reputation. Reputation didn't keep cattle fed. It didn't fix fences or pay debts. Survival did. 3 weeks later, she'd received 4 responses. The first was from a man who couldn't spell and whose letter was mostly about how he'd treat her real good if she knew what he meant. She'd burn that one immediately. The second was from a widower with 6 children who clearly just wanted a free housekeeper and mother for his brood. No thank you. The third seemed promising until the end, where he mentioned that his previous wives hadn't understood him. Wives, plural. That was a red flag the size of Nebraska. The fourth letter was different. It was short, maybe 100 words total. The handwriting was neat but unpracticed, like someone who'd learned to write as an adult and worked hard to make it legible. "Mrs. Holloway, I read your notice. I'm 38, healthy, experienced with cattle and farm work. I fought in the war, worked railroads, done some mining. I'm not looking for romance either, just honest work and a place to belong. I can leave St. Louis within a week if you're willing to take a chance. Caleb Mercer." There was no poetry in it. No false promises or sweet words, just facts laid out plain. Margaret had read it 5 times, looking for warning signs, for anything that suggested this Caleb Mercer was dangerous or crazy or lying. But there was nothing, just a simple offer from what sounded like a simple man. She'd written back the same day. Mr. Mercer, arrive in Red Creek on the 10th. Train comes through at 2. I'll meet you at the station. If this works, we'll marry quickly. The ranch needs help immediately. If it doesn't work, I'll pay your return fare. Margaret Holloway. Now it was the 10th, and Margaret stood in her kitchen, dressed in her only decent dress. Dark blue wool that was 5 years old and showed it. Her hair was pinned back severely. She wore no jewelry except her wedding band from Thomas, and even that felt like a lie since she was about to marry someone else. The clock on the mantel said 1:30. She had 30 minutes to get to town. The ride into Red Creek was cold enough to freeze bone marrow. Margaret sat in the wagon seat with the old mare pulling them along at a pace that suggested the horse was as unenthusiastic about this trip as she was. The prairie stretched out on both sides, white with frost and brown with dead grass. Nothing moved except the wind. Red Creek wasn't much of a town. Main Street had maybe 20 buildings. A general store, a bank, a hotel, a saloon, a church, a blacksmith, and a scattering of houses. The train station sat at the north end like an afterthought, just a platform and a small shelter where people could wait out of the weather. Margaret tied up the mare and stood on the platform, watching the eastern horizon for smoke. She wasn't alone. A few other people had gathered, Mrs. Chen waiting for a package, old Porter, who met every train because he had nothing better to do, and unfortunately, Rachel Morrison and her daughter Beth, 2 of the worst gossips in town. Rachel spotted Margaret immediately, and her eyes lit up with malicious curiosity. "Margaret Holloway," she called out, her voice sugary sweet and fake as hell. "What brings you to the station? Expecting someone?" "Just picking up supplies," Margaret lied. "Supplies come by freight wagon, dear, not passenger train." Beth giggled behind her hand. She was 19 and pretty in that soft way that wouldn't last past 30. "Maybe she's got a gentleman caller coming." "Don't be silly," Rachel said, but her eyes were bright with speculation. "Margaret's in mourning, aren't you, dear?" Margaret didn't answer. She just turned away and stared at the horizon, willing the train to appear so this could be over with. The whistle sounded at 5 minutes past 2. The train came rolling in with a screech of brakes and a cloud of steam, all black iron and industrial noise that seemed out of place in the prairie silence. A handful of passengers climbed down, a salesman with sample cases, a young couple who looked newly married, an old woman being helped by a porter, and then a man who had to be Caleb Mercer. He was tall, but not unusually so, maybe 6 feet, lean with the kind of wiriness that came from hard work rather than regular meals. He wore patched work pants, a coat that had seen better decades, and a hat that was more function than fashion. He carried one small bag, the kind a traveling salesman might use, and that was apparently everything he owned. His face was weathered, tanned dark by sun and wind. He had a thick beard shot through with gray, and eyes that were hard to read from a distance. 40 years old or maybe older. Not handsome in any conventional way, but not ugly either, just worn. He looked exactly like what he'd claimed to be, a working man who'd been working too long. Margaret stepped forward before she could lose her nerve. "Mr. Mercer?" He turned, and up close she could see his eyes were blue-gray, the color of winter sky. They took her in with one quick assessment, not leering or judgmental, just measuring, seeing what he'd gotten himself into. "Mrs. Holloway." His voice was deep, rough around the edges, like he didn't use it much. "Appreciate you meeting me." "You made it," she said, which was a stupid thing to say since obviously he had. "Said I would." They stood there awkwardly for a moment while Rachel Morrison's eyes burned holes in both of them from 20 feet away. "We should go," Margaret said. "It's a cold day to stand around talking." "Yes, ma'am." He followed her to the wagon, tossed his bag in the back, and climbed up beside her without needing help or invitation. Margaret snapped the reins, and the old mare started the journey back toward the ranch. They didn't speak for the first mile. Margaret kept sneaking glances at him from the corner of her eye, trying to figure out what kind of man she'd just imported into her life. He sat still, watching the prairie roll past, seemingly unbothered by the silence or the cold or the scrutiny. Finally, she couldn't stand it anymore. "The letter I sent mentioned the situation," she said, "but I should be clear about exactly what you're walking into. The ranch is in bad shape. Fences are down. Cattle are half-starved. The barn roof leaks. I owe $1,500 that I don't have, and I've got 60 days, well, 58 now, before the bank forecloses. It's going to be hard work, constant work, and there's no guarantee we'll save it. Okay, Caleb said. Okay? She glanced at him. That's all you have to say? What else is there? You told me it was hard work. I believed you. Wouldn't have come if I was afraid of that. Most men would want to know what they're getting in return. You mentioned partnership marriage in your letter. I figure that means I help save the ranch. I get to stay on it, work it with you. That's more than I've had in years, Mrs. Holloway. That's enough. The simple honesty of it caught her off guard. She'd expected negotiation, maybe some demands about sleeping arrangements or property rights or God knows what, but he just accepted it. We'll need to marry quickly, she said, staring straight ahead at the road. Not because I care about propriety, but because the neighbors will make trouble if we don't. Small town, small minds. When? Tomorrow, if possible. There's a minister in town. We can do it at the church. Simple ceremony, no fuss. Fine with me. Another mile of silence. Then Caleb spoke again. Can I ask you something, Mrs. Holloway? Go ahead. Why'd you write that letter? I mean, I know you need help, but there's other kinds of help. Hired hands, foremen. Why a husband? Margaret considered the question. She could lie, give him some soft answer about companionship or partnership. But if they were going to do this, really do this, she might as well be honest. Because hired hands leave when the money runs out, she said, and the money's already gone. I needed someone who had a stake in making this work. Someone who'd lose everything if I lost everything. That's you now, Mr. Mercer. Like it or not, your fate is tied to mine. He nodded slowly. That's fair, honest, at least. I'm not much for lying. Good. Neither am I. The ranch appeared on the horizon like a broken promise. Sagging buildings, tilted fences, dead grass. Even from a distance, it looked like defeat. Margaret felt her chest tighten with shame. This is what she was offering him. This wreck. This disaster. But when she glanced at Caleb, his expression hadn't changed. He just studied the place with those winter sky eyes, taking inventory. Seen worse? He said quietly. Have you? Yes, ma'am. Seen a lot worse. They pulled up to the house and Margaret climbed down, suddenly exhausted despite it not even being evening yet. Caleb grabbed his bag and followed her inside. The house was cold. She'd let the fire die down to save wood. The furniture was sparse, a table, 3 chairs, one wobbly, a shelf with some chipped dishes, a rocking chair by the fireplace that had been Thomas's and that she still couldn't bring herself to sit in. You can sleep in the spare room, Margaret said, pointing to a door off the main room. It's small, but it's got a bed and a window. There's a stove out back for washing up. Outhouse is behind the barn. Caleb set his bag down and looked around with the same careful assessment he'd given the prairie. This'll do fine. I'll cook something. It won't be much. Mrs. Holloway. He turned to face her directly. I didn't come here expecting luxury. I came to work. So if you're ready, I'd like to take a look at what needs doing before the light goes. She blinked. Now? You just got here. Yes, ma'am. And according to you, we've got 58 days to save this place. Don't seem like we have time to waste on settling in. Something shifted in Margaret's chest. Not hope exactly. She'd trained herself not to feel that anymore, but maybe possibility. All right, she said. Let me get my coat. They spent the next 2 hours walking the property while Caleb made mental notes. He checked the fences, examined the barn structure, counted cattle, assessed the well, looked at every broken thing with the eye of someone calculating how much work it would take to fix it. Margaret followed along, answering his questions. Yes, the north fence had been down since October. No, she didn't have materials to replace it. Yes, she knew the cattle were too thin. No, she couldn't afford feed. Yes, she knew everything was broken. She'd been living in it for 8 months. But Caleb didn't seem discouraged. He just kept making his assessments, occasionally nodding to himself like he was solving a puzzle only he could see. By the time they finished, the sun was setting, painting the prairie in shades of gold and red that would have been beautiful if Margaret had any energy left to appreciate it. They stood near the barn, breath steaming in the cold air. Well, Margaret asked. What do you think? Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I think we're going to need a lot of wire, some good timber, and about 6 months that we don't have. That's not encouraging. Wasn't trying to be. He looked at her. But I also think it's possible. Hard, but possible. If we work smart and we work together. And if we can't make enough money in time, then we go down fighting, but at least we go down knowing we tried everything. It wasn't comfort. It wasn't even optimism. But it was something Margaret hadn't had in months. Someone standing beside her who wasn't waiting for her to fail. Thank you, she said quietly. For what? For not running back to the train station. The corner of his mouth twitched. It might have been a smile, but it was hard to tell under the beard. Day's not over yet, Mrs. Holloway. That night, Margaret cooked beans and cornbread, which was basically all she had. They ate in silence at the table, the only sound the scrape of spoons against tin plates and the wind outside rattling the windows. Afterward, Caleb excused himself to the spare room, and Margaret sat alone by the fire, staring into the flames. Tomorrow, she would marry a stranger. In 2 months, she'd either save the ranch or lose everything trying. And for the first time since Thomas died, she wasn't facing it alone. Whether that was a blessing or just a different kind of curse remained to be seen. The wedding happened at 10 o'clock on a Wednesday morning in a church that smelled like old wood and candle wax. Margaret wore the same blue dress she'd worn to the train station. Caleb wore the same patched clothes. Neither of them had rings. The minister, Reverend Talbot, was a thin man in his 60s who'd known Margaret since she was a girl and couldn't quite hide his confusion about what was happening. Are you certain about this, Margaret? He'd asked before the ceremony, pulling her aside in the church vestibule. Yes. You barely know this man. He could be anyone. He's someone willing to help. That's more than most people have offered. Talbot had sighed but didn't argue further. He was too polite for that, even when he thought someone was making a terrible mistake. The ceremony itself lasted maybe 10 minutes. There were no guests except Mrs. Chen, who'd been recruited as a witness and spent the whole time looking at Caleb like he might pull a knife at any moment, an old porter who probably just wanted something to gossip about later. Do you, Caleb Mercer, take this woman? I do. Do you, Margaret Holloway, take this man? I do. Then by the power vested in me. And just like that, Margaret was married for the second time in her life. They signed the certificate. Reverend Talbot pronounced them husband and wife without suggesting they kiss. Margaret paid him $2 she couldn't afford, and then they walked back out into the winter morning as Mr. and Mrs. Mercer. The gossip started before they'd even reached the wagon. Margaret could see Rachel Morrison standing outside the general store with Beth and 2 other women, their heads bent together like conspirators. When they noticed Margaret looking, Rachel waved with exaggerated cheerfulness. Congratulations, dear. So sudden. We had no idea you were courting. Margaret ignored her and climbed onto the wagon seat. Caleb settled beside her. Friends of yours? Vultures. Ah, every town's got those. They rode back to the ranch in silence, same as before. But this time there was a piece of paper in Margaret's pocket that said they were legally bound. For better or worse, this stranger was now her husband. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, she just felt tired. When they reached the ranch, Caleb didn't waste time. I'm going to start on the north fence, he said, climbing down. Lost cattle or lost money? Need to fix that first. You'll need tools. They're in the barn, but they're not in good shape. I'll make do. He disappeared into the barn and emerged a few minutes later with a hammer, some wire, and a post hole digger that looked like it might fall apart if you sneezed on it. Then he headed north without another word. Margaret watched him go, this man who was now legally her husband, trudging across frozen ground to fix fences in weather cold enough to crack stone. She should probably feel something, gratitude, relief, something. Instead, she felt numb. She went inside, built up the fire, and started making bread dough because that's what you did. You kept moving. You kept working. Because the moment you stopped, the moment you let yourself think too hard about your situation, that's when the despair crept in and pulled you under. So she didn't stop. The days that followed fell into a brutal rhythm. They woke before dawn. Caleb would head out to work on fences while Margaret handled the cattle, feeding them the scraps of hay she had left, checking for sickness, trying to keep them alive long enough to be worth something. Then she'd work on whatever needed doing inside, mending clothes, preserving what little food they had, keeping the house from falling apart. Around midday, she'd bring Caleb whatever passed for lunch, usually just bread and water, maybe some dried meat if they were lucky. He'd eat standing up, never stopping work for more than 5 minutes. Then back to it until dark. They barely spoke. There wasn't time and there wasn't energy. Conversation was a luxury, and they were living on necessities. But Margaret noticed things. She noticed that Caleb worked like a man possessed. His hands bled from wire cuts and splinters, but he never complained. When the post-hole digger finally broke, he made a new one out of scrap metal and kept going. When the weather turned worse and ice made the ground almost impossible to dig, he just dug harder. She noticed that he was careful with the cattle, talking to them in a low voice when he thought she wasn't listening. Gentle hands despite the hard work. She noticed that he never asked for more than his share of food, even though he was doing twice the physical labor she was. And she noticed that every night, after they'd eaten their pitiful dinner in silence, he'd say, "Good night, Mrs. Mercer," before disappearing into his room, leaving her alone by the fire. Mrs. Mercer. Not Margaret. Always the formal address, always that careful distance. It should have been a relief. That's what she'd wanted, after all. A business arrangement, not a marriage. But sometimes, sitting alone in the firelight, she felt the weight of that distance like a stone in her chest. 3 weeks after the wedding, Sam Pritchard came back. He rode up with his usual entourage, dismounted like he owned the place, and found Caleb working on the barn roof. "You there?" Sam called up. "Where's Margaret?" Caleb barely glanced down. "Mrs. Mercer's in the house." "Mrs. Mercer?" Sam's eyebrows rose. "Is that so?" "Yes, sir." "Well, I'll be damned." Sam walked toward the house, shaking his head. The widow actually did it. Found herself a husband. Margaret met him at the door before he could knock. "Sam, Margaret, or should I say Mrs. Mercer now?" His smile was all teeth. "Heard some interesting news in town. Seems you got married. To a stranger, no less. Very sudden." "My business is my own." Of course. I'm just concerned. As a neighbor, as a friend." "We're not friends, Sam." His smile didn't falter. "Fair enough. Then as someone who's made you a generous offer, I'm curious to know if marriage changes your situation. You still owe the bank $1,500, Margaret. A husband doesn't make that disappear." "We're aware." "Are you?" "Because I've been asking around about this Caleb Mercer. Nobody knows him. He just appeared out of nowhere, married you in a week, and now he's working your ranch like he owns it." "He does own it. Half of it, anyway. That's what marriage means." Sam's expression hardened. "You gave away half your ranch to a stranger? Jesus, Margaret, what were you thinking?" "I was thinking I needed help, and unlike some people, Caleb actually offered it." "I offered to buy you out, to give you a fresh start. You offered to steal my land for half what it's worth." They stared at each other, the air thick with tension. Finally, Sam took a breath and reset his smile. "Look, I didn't come here to fight. I came to make sure you understand your situation. You've got, 5 weeks left before foreclosure, maybe 6? Even with 2 of you working, you can't possibly earn $1,500 in that time. It's impossible." "We'll see." "Margaret, is there anything else, Sam? Because we have work to do." His jaw tightened. For a moment she thought he might argue further, but then he tipped his hat, that false courtesy, back in place. "Just trying to help, Margaret. When this falls apart, and it will, my offer still stands. For now." He rode away, leaving Margaret standing on the porch with her hands clenched into fists. Caleb climbed down from the barn roof, watching Sam's group disappear toward the horizon. "Friend of yours?" he asked. "That was Sam Pritchard, richest man in the county. He wants our land. Seemed real friendly about it. He's a snake, a well-dressed snake who'll smile while he steals everything you have." Caleb nodded, filing that information away. "Well, we better make sure he doesn't get the chance. Easier said than done." "Most things are." He went back to work, and Margaret went back inside, but the encounter had rattled her. Because Sam was right about one thing: they were running out of time. That night, after dinner, Margaret pulled out the ledgers and made Caleb look at them. "Here's where we are," she said, spreading papers across the table. "We owe the bank $1,200 principal plus $300 in interest. We have 42 days left. We currently have, she checked the jar on the shelf, $17.30 in cash. Caleb studied the numbers in silence. The cat something, Margaret continued, but not enough. Even if we sold every head tomorrow, we'd barely make 400, and then we'd have no stock to rebuild with. So we can't sell the cattle. No. What else is theirs? Margaret leaned back in her chair, exhausted just thinking about it. I've been doing sewing work in town. It brings in maybe $2-3 a week if I'm lucky. Not nearly enough. We could sell the horses, but we need them for work. Could sell more tools, but same problem. Could sell the furniture, but who'd buy it? What about hiring out? Caleb asked. Temporary work for other ranchers? Maybe, but it's winter. Nobody's hiring much. They sat there staring at numbers that didn't add up no matter how you arranged them. Finally, Caleb said, There's got to be something we're missing. Some way to earn that doesn't require selling everything we need to survive. If there is, I haven't found it in 8 months of looking. Then we keep looking. He said it with such certainty, like it was simple, like wanting something badly enough could make it real. Margaret wanted to believe him, but belief was another luxury she'd run out of. Yeah, the answer came from an unexpected place. Margaret was in town the following week, delivering mended clothes to Mrs. Peterson and picking up flowers she couldn't really afford, when she overheard a conversation at the general store. Terrible shame, a man was saying. Henderson's forge is backed up 3 weeks. Said his apprentice quit, and he can't keep up with orders. Margaret's ears perked up. She walked over to where Jack Henderson, the town blacksmith, was loading supplies onto his cart. He was a broad-shouldered man in his 50s, perpetually covered in soot. Jack, she said, I couldn't help overhearing. You need help at the forge? He looked at her, surprised. Well, yes, but I don't think... My husband has experience. He worked railroads, done metal work. He could help you catch up. Your husband? Jack looked skeptical. You mean that stranger you married? Margaret, I don't know. Just talk to him. Give him a test. If he can't do the work, you've lost nothing. But if he can, you solve your problem and we earn some money. Everybody wins. Jack rubbed his jaw, considering. I suppose it wouldn't hurt to talk. Send him by tomorrow morning. Margaret rode back to the ranch faster than she should have, given the icy roads. When she burst into the house, Caleb was bent over the fireplace, trying to fix a crack in the stonework. I might have found us some work, she said breathlessly. Blacksmithing, in town. It wouldn't be every day, but it could bring in steady money. Caleb straightened up. You sure the smith wants help from someone he doesn't know? He needs help, desperately, and I told him you have experience. I do. Some. Did forge work on the railroads. Wasn't my main job, but I know my way around an anvil. Then tomorrow morning, you talk to Jack Henderson. Convince him you can do the work. For the first time since arriving, Caleb smiled. A small one, but real. Yes, ma'am, he said. I can do that. The next morning, Caleb rode into town on the old mare and didn't come back until sunset. Margaret spent the entire day anxious, working herself into knots, wondering if Jack had turned him away, if the opportunity had fallen through, if they were back to square one. When she finally heard hoofbeats approaching, she practically ran outside. Caleb dismounted, moving stiffly like he was sore. Well, Margaret demanded. He hired me, 3 days a week to start. If I do good work, maybe more. Relief washed over her so strongly she had to grab the porch railing for support. How much? $2 a day. $2? That was $6 a week. In a month, that could be $24. Still nowhere near $1,500, but it was something. It was progress. That's good, she managed. That's really good. It's a start, Caleb agreed. He paused, then added, Jack said if you can handle deliveries for finished work, he'll pay you 50 cents per delivery. Saves him the trip. I can do that. Thought you might. They stood there in the fading light, and for the first time Margaret felt something that might have been hope stirring in her chest. Maybe they could actually do this. Maybe. Halt. The work became relentless. 3 days a week, Caleb rode into town before dawn and worked the forge until dark, coming home covered in soot and exhausted. The other 4 days, he worked the ranch, fixing fences, repairing buildings, caring for cattle, doing the work of 3 men. Margaret matched him. She took Jack's deliveries, carrying tools and hardware to customers all over the county. She took every sewing job offered, She started doing bookkeeping for two local businesses who needed their accounts organized. She worked until her hands cramped and her eyes blurred. Every penny went into the jar on the shelf. They counted it obsessively. $17 became 23. 23 became 31. 31 became 46. But it wasn't enough. It was never enough. The calendar kept moving. 40 days left. 35. 30. One night, Margaret sat at the table doing math that refused to work. Even if they kept earning at their current rate, which wasn't guaranteed, they'd maybe have $200 by the deadline. 200 out of 1,500 needed. She put her head in her hands, feeling defeat creeping back in. Hey, she looked up. Caleb was standing in the doorway of his room, watching her with those winter sky eyes. You should sleep, he said. Staying up worrying won't change the numbers. I know. I just keep thinking there must be something we're missing, some way to earn faster. Caleb crossed the room and sat down across from her. For a moment, he just looked at the scattered papers and the jar of money that represented weeks of brutal work. Then he said, when I was working railroads, we had a foreman who used to say, can't build 100 miles of track in one day, but you can build 1 mile 100 times. Meaning you just keep showing up. You do the work in front of you, and eventually you get there. But we're running out of days to show up. Then we work smarter, find bigger jobs, riskier jobs, things that pay more because nobody else wants to do them. Like what? I don't know yet, but we'll find something. His confidence was maddening. How could he be so certain when everything suggested they were doomed? Why are you still here? Margaret asked suddenly. You could leave, take your share of what we've earned, and go somewhere easier. Somewhere that isn't a sinking ship. Caleb looked at her for a long moment. This doesn't feel like a sinking ship to me, Mrs. Mercer. Feels like a fight. And I've spent most of my life running from fights. Thought maybe it was time to stay for one. Something in his voice made Margaret's throat tight. Thank you, she whispered. Don't thank me yet. We haven't won anything. But when he went back to his room and she was alone again, Margaret realized something had changed. She wasn't facing this alone anymore, and that mattered more than she'd ever admit out loud. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday morning when Caleb was shoeing a horse at Henderson's Forge and overheard two ranchers complaining about their fencing problems. Lost 12 head last month, the older one was saying, a grizzled man named Dutch Werner who ran cattle south of Red Creek. Damn fences keep breaking in this cold. Can't find anyone willing to work in this weather. The younger rancher, Billy Sutton, nodded agreement. Same here. Posted notices for hands, but nobody's biting. Everyone wants spring work. Nobody wants to freeze their ass off for fence repair. Caleb set down his hammer and wiped soot from his face. Excuse me, gentlemen. Couldn't help overhearing. My wife and I do fence work. Been repairing our own place these past weeks. Dutch looked him over skeptically. You the stranger who married the Holloway widow? Yes, sir. Caleb Mercer. Heard about you? Town's talking? Dutch spat tobacco juice into the dirt. You any good with fences, or you just desperate? Both, probably, but the fences hold, which is what matters. Billy laughed at that. Fair enough. What's your rate? Caleb hadn't thought that far ahead, but he kept his expression neutral. Depends on the work. But we're fair, and we're fast. Tell you what, Dutch said, I got about 2 miles of fence on my north boundary that's falling apart. You fix it proper, I'll pay you $30. $30. That was 2 weeks of forge work in one job. When do you need it done? Caleb asked, keeping his voice level even as his heart rate picked up. Week? Maybe 2. Weather permitting. We can do it in a week. Dutch raised an eyebrow. 2 of you? 2 miles in a week during winter? Yes, sir. You're either very good or very stupid. We'll find out which, Caleb said. They shook on it, and Caleb rode home that evening with news that actually felt like hope instead of just delayed defeat. Margaret was in the barn when he arrived, trying to convince one of the cows to eat. The animal was sick, ribs showing, eyes dull. It probably wouldn't survive the winter, but she kept trying anyway. Dutch Werner hired us for fence work, Caleb said, without preamble. $30 for 2 miles. Needs it done in a week. Margaret stood up so fast she startled the cow. $30? That's what he said. That's more than we make in 2 weeks combined. I know. Can we actually do it? 2 miles in a week? Caleb pulled off his hat and ran a hand through his hair. It was longer now than when he'd arrived, shaggy and unkempt. Neither of them had time or energy for things like haircuts. Honestly, I don't know, but I told him we could, so figure it out. Margaret looked at the sick cow, then back at Caleb. He could see her doing the math, calculating what $30 could mean for them. When do we start? She asked. Tomorrow morning, if you're willing. I'm willing. The next day, before dawn, they loaded the wagon with tools and materials purchased on credit from Jack Henderson. Wire, posts, a better post hole digger. The temperature was below freezing, and the wind cut through their coats like they were made of paper. Dutch Werner's ranch was an hour's ride northeast. When they arrived, he was waiting with his foreman, a silent man named Hicks, who looked at Margaret like she was a curiosity. You brought your wife? Dutch said. She's half the team, Caleb replied. Problem with that? Just surprised is all. Most women aren't me, Margaret interrupted. Where's the fence line? Dutch pointed north. Runs from that marker to the creek bed. Hicks will show you. Posts are rotted, wires broken in a dozen places. Needs a complete rebuild. They surveyed the damage in growing daylight. It was worse than Caleb had expected. The posts weren't just rotted, some had been knocked over by cattle, others had simply disintegrated from age and weather. The wire was a tangled mess of breaks and rust. This is going to be hell, Margaret said quietly. Yep. Can we actually do it? We have to. They worked in a rhythm that developed out of necessity rather than practice. Caleb would dig the post holes, brutal work in frozen ground that made his shoulders scream and his hands bleed despite gloves. Margaret would prepare the posts, cutting them to size, treating the ends with tar to prevent rot. Then together, they'd lift and set each post, tamping the dirt tight, stringing wire between them with tension that had to be just right, or the whole thing would sag. The cold was relentless. By mid-morning, Margaret's fingers were so numb she could barely grip the wire cutters. By afternoon, Caleb's back had seized up so badly he could barely straighten. But they kept going because stopping meant failing, and failing meant losing everything. They worked until dark, then made camp right there on the fence line rather than waste time riding back. Dutch had said they could use an old line shack on the property, a tiny one-room shelter that was barely warmer than being outside but at least blocked the wind. Margaret built a fire while Caleb tended the horses. They ate cold beans and hard bread because that's what they'd brought. And warming food would mean wasting fuel they needed for heat during the night. How much did we finish today? Margaret asked, her voice hoarse from breathing cold air all day. Caleb calculated. Maybe quarter mile, if we're lucky. We need 2 miles in 7 days. I know what it is. We need to work faster. I don't know how we can work faster and still do it right. We'll figure it out tomorrow. They sat in silence, watching the fire burn down. The line shack was cramped, barely 10 feet square. There was one narrow cot that looked like it might collapse if you breathed on it wrong. You take the cot, Caleb said. I'll sleep on the floor. Don't be ridiculous. We'll share it. We're both adults, and I'm too tired to care about propriety. It was the first time since the wedding that they'd addressed the careful distance they'd been maintaining. Caleb looked uncomfortable. Mrs. Mercer, it's Margaret. We're married, we're freezing, and I'm not going to let you sleep on the floor out of some misplaced sense of chivalry. Get on the damn cot. He did, though he stayed as far to one edge as possible without falling off. Margaret lay down on the other side, and they arranged their coats over both of them as makeshift blankets. The cot was so narrow they were pressed against each other, sharing warmth whether they wanted to or not. Margaret could feel Caleb's breathing, steady and slow, could feel the tension in his body from the day's work. Thank you, she said into the darkness, for doing this, for staying. You already thanked me. I know, but I mean it more now. Why? She thought about how to answer that. Because you didn't have to dig post holes until your hands bled. You didn't have to sleep in a freezing shack on a broken cot. You could have done the minimum and collected your share, but you didn't. Neither did you. This is my ranch. It's our ranch now, Caleb said quietly. That's what the marriage certificate says. Our ranch. The words hung in the cold air between them. Margaret fell asleep to the sound of wind and the warmth of another human being beside her for the first time in 8 months, and she didn't dream of Thomas or death or foreclosure. She just slept, deep and dreamless, the sleep of exhaustion. They woke before dawn and went back to work. The second day was harder than the first. Their muscles were already sore, their hands already raw. But they pushed through, developing a faster rhythm. Margaret started digging holes while Caleb prepared posts. They worked simultaneously instead of sequentially, doubling their output. By evening, they'd finished half a mile total. Still behind schedule, but closer. The third day brought new problems. A storm rolled in around noon, dropping snow and ice that made everything 10 times harder. The ground became even more difficult to dig. The wire became slippery and dangerous. Margaret slipped while carrying a post and fell hard, bruising her hip badly enough that walking hurt. "We should stop," Caleb said, helping her up. "Wait out the storm. We can't afford to wait." "Margaret, we can't afford it," she repeated and limped back to work. Caleb watched her go, and something in his expression shifted. Respect, maybe. Or recognition. One stubborn person seeing another. He went back to digging. By the fourth day, they were both operating on pure spite and determination. Every movement hurt. Every breath burned from the cold. But they were making progress. 3/4 of a mile finished, 1 1/4 to go. Still possible if they could maintain the pace. That night, huddled in the line shack again, Margaret's hands shook so badly she couldn't light the fire. Caleb took the matches from her without comment and got it started while she sat with her head in her hands, trying not to cry from pain and exhaustion. "Here," he said, handing her a tin cup of weak coffee he'd somehow managed to make. "Drink this. We're out of coffee. Found some in the shack. Old, but drinkable." She drank it anyway, letting the warmth spread through her chest. Caleb sat beside her on the cot, and this time neither of them bothered with the pretense of distance. They just sat close, sharing heat, too tired for awkwardness. "I keep thinking about what we're doing," Margaret said after a while. "Breaking ourselves for $30. It's insane." "Probably. And even if we finish this job, get the money, it's still not enough. We'd need to do 10 more jobs like this, 20 more, and there's not enough time. So we do what we can and see what happens." "That's not a plan, Caleb." "No," he agreed, "but it's what we've got." Margaret laughed, a bitter sound. "You're terrible at encouragement. Never claimed to be good at it." They sat in silence for a moment. Then Caleb spoke again, his voice quiet. "Can I tell you something?" "Sure. This is the hardest I've ever worked in my life. And I've done some hard work. But it's also, I don't know, the first time in years I felt like I was working towards something instead of just working to survive the next day." Margaret turned to look at him in the firelight. His face was shadowed, beard scruffy, eyes tired, but somehow still steady. "What do you mean?" she asked. "I mean, after the war I spent a long time just drifting, railroad to railroad, town to town. Never staying anywhere, never building anything, just earning enough to eat and move on. And I told myself that was freedom, but it was really just running." "From what?" "Everything, memories, responsibilities. Myself, probably." He stared into the fire. "But this, what we're doing here, it feels different. Like it matters. It matters because we'll lose everything if we fail. No. It matters because we're building something. Even if we do lose the ranch, we built fences that'll last. We worked forge jobs that helped people. We didn't just give up and drift away. We fought." Margaret felt something crack open in her chest. Some wall she'd built around herself after Thomas died, after months of facing everything alone. "I haven't told you about Thomas," she said suddenly. Caleb waited, not pushing. "He wasn't a good husband. Not really. He was difficult, angry a lot, made bad decisions and blamed everyone else. When he died, I grieved, but honestly, part of me was relieved, and I felt guilty about that every day since." "You can grieve someone and still be relieved they're gone," Caleb said. "Those things aren't opposites. Everyone in town thinks I married too fast, that I didn't respect Thomas's memory. Maybe they're right. Or maybe you did what you needed to survive. Nothing wrong with that." Margaret looked at him. "Is that what you did when you answered my letter?" "Yes, ma'am. I was living in a boarding house, spending my last dollars on rotgut whiskey and going nowhere fast. Your letter offered something better than that. I took it." "No regrets?" He considered the question seriously. "My hands are bleeding, my back's wrecked, I'm sleeping on a cot in a shack that's colder than a tomb, and we're probably going to lose the ranch anyway. But no regrets. Why not? Because for the first time in a long time, I'm not alone. It's worth something. Margaret's throat felt tight. She wanted to say something, but words felt inadequate. So instead, she just moved a little closer, letting her shoulder press against his. They sat like that until the fire burned down. And when they finally lay down to sleep, the distance between them on the narrow cot was smaller than it had been before. The fifth day broke clear and cold. They were both so sore they could barely move at first, but movement warmed muscles and they fell back into the rhythm. Dig, prepare, set, string. Dig, prepare, set, string. Over and over until the work became almost meditative. By evening, they'd finished 1.5 miles. Only half a mile left, and 2 full days to do it. For the first time, Margaret let herself believe they might actually finish. That night, Dutch Werner rode out to check their progress. He walked the fence line with Hicks, testing posts, examining wire tension, looking for shortcuts or shoddy work. He found none. "I'll be damned," he said when he came back to where Margaret and Caleb were packing up tools. "You two actually know what you're doing." "Told you we did," Caleb said. "Most people talk big and deliver small. You talked big and backed it up." Dutch pulled out a leather wallet. "Tell you what, you finish this job tomorrow, I've got another one for you. South Boundary needs work too. Another $40. Margaret and Caleb looked at each other. $40. Combined with the 30 from this job, that would be $70 total, more than they'd made in the entire month before. "We'll take it," Margaret said. "Good. Finish here first, though. Do it right." They finished the next day by mid-afternoon. 2 full miles of fence, rebuilt from scratch, solid enough to hold cattle through a stampede. Dutch inspected every inch of it personally, then counted out $30 into Caleb's hand without comment. "Start the South Boundary tomorrow," he said. Same quality, same speed. They rode back to their own ranch that evening in silence, both too exhausted to speak. When they arrived, the place looked different somehow. Still broken in places, still struggling, but not quite as desperate as it had been 3 weeks ago. Inside, Margaret pulled out the jar and added the $30. They now had $73 total. Still nowhere near $1,500, but it was progress. Real, tangible progress. "We can do this," she said, staring at the money. "If we keep getting jobs like this, if we keep working, we can do this," Caleb agreed. That night, they each slept in their own rooms for the first time in a week, and Margaret lay awake missing the warmth of someone beside her more than she wanted to admit. The South Boundary job took another week and went smoother than the first. They'd learned from their mistakes, refined their system. When Dutch paid them the $40, he also gave them something else: recommendations. "Werner says you do good work," Billy Sutton told them when he hired them to repair his fences. "Says you're fast and you don't cut corners." Word spread. Suddenly, there were more jobs than they could handle. Fix a barn roof for $15, repair a corral for $10, rebuild a chicken coop for $8. Nothing huge, but it added up. They worked themselves to the bone, taking every job offered. Caleb still worked the forge 3 days a week. Margaret still did deliveries and sewing and bookkeeping. But now they also had the fence and repair work, which paid better and kept them busy every spare moment. The jar on the shelf grew heavier. 73 became 90. 90 became 120. 120 became 160. And with 20 days left until foreclosure, they started to believe they might actually make it. But Red Creek was a small town, and success attracted attention. Sam Pritchard noticed. Of course he noticed. He'd been watching Margaret for months, waiting for her to fail so he could swoop in and buy the ranch for pennies. Now she wasn't failing. She was fighting back, and worse, she was winning. He showed up at the ranch on a Saturday afternoon, dismounting from his black stallion like he was doing them a favor with his presence. Margaret met him at the door. "Sam, what do you want?" "Just checking in on my favorite neighbor. Heard you've been doing quite well lately. Fence work all over the county." "Business is good." "I'm sure it is. Must be nice, having help." His eyes drifted past her to where Caleb was working on the barn. "Your husband seems, capable." "He is. Curious thing, though. I've been asking around about him. Before he showed up here, nobody seems to know anything about Caleb Mercer. It's like he didn't exist." Margaret's jaw tightened. People come west to start over. That's not unusual. No, it's not. But it does make me wonder what he's running from. He's not running from anything. How would you know? You married him after knowing him for what? A week? Sam smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. I'm just concerned, Margaret, as a neighbor. What if he's a criminal? What if he's using you? He's not. You sound very certain for someone who barely knows him. Caleb had stopped working and was walking toward them, wiping grease from his hands. There a problem here, Mrs. Mercer? No problem, Sam said smoothly. Just having a friendly conversation. Didn't sound friendly. Well, you'd know about unfriendly, wouldn't you, given your mysterious past? Caleb's expression didn't change. My past is my business, Mr. Pritchard, just like yours is yours. I'm an open book. Been in Red Creek for 20 years. People know me. People knowing you doesn't make you trustworthy, just makes you familiar. Sam's smile finally cracked. Careful, Mercer. You're new here. You don't want to make enemies. Don't particularly want to make friends either. Just want to be left alone to work our ranch. Your ranch? Sam laughed. You've been here 5 minutes. This is Margaret's ranch. You're just the hired help who got a wedding ring out of the deal. Margaret stepped forward, her voice cold. Caleb is my husband and my partner. This is our ranch. And unless you have actual business here, Sam, I'd appreciate it if you'd leave. Sam looked between them, and for a moment something ugly flashed across his face. Then he smoothed it away, replaced it with that politician's smile. Of course. My apologies. I'll leave you two to your work. He mounted his horse, then paused. One more thing, Margaret. You still owe the bank $1,500. And from what I hear, you've got maybe $200 saved. Even with all your fence work, you're going to come up short. When you do, remember my offer stands. I'll still buy the ranch. But the price drops every day you wait. He rode off, leaving them standing in his dust. Who the hell was that really? Caleb asked quietly. A vulture waiting for us to die so he can pick our bones, Margaret said bitterly. He's wanted this land for years, thinks he can outlast us. Can he? Margaret looked at the jar on the shelf visible through the window. $203. They'd been working themselves to death and they had $200. $1,500 seemed impossible again. I don't know, she admitted. The math doesn't work, Caleb. Even if we take every job offered, even if we work every single day until foreclosure, we won't make enough. We'd need a miracle. Caleb was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the prairie. Then he said, What if we sold the timber? Margaret blinked. What timber? Come with me. He led her to the northeast corner of the property, past the old fence line to a section she rarely visited. There, in a shallow valley protected from wind, was a grove of hardwood trees, oak and ash, maybe 20 of them, mature and tall. I found these when I was surveying the property that first week, Caleb said. Didn't mention them because I wasn't sure they mattered. But hardwood timber is valuable. These trees are old growth, big diameter. Could be worth a few $100s if we cut them and haul them to the lumber mill. Margaret walked into the grove, looking up at branches that had been growing there long before she was born. Thomas had mentioned these trees once, said he'd cut them someday for firewood, but he'd never gotten around to it. How much do you think? She asked. I'd have to measure and calculate board feet, but maybe $500? Maybe more if we're lucky, $400. Combined with what they had, that would be $600. Still not enough, but closer. So much closer. But it's winter, Margaret said. Logging in winter is dangerous, and we'd have to do it ourselves. Can't afford hired help. I know, it's a risk. If one of us gets hurt, we lose everything anyway. Yes, ma'am. Margaret touched the trunk of the nearest oak, feeling rough bark under her palm. These trees had survived droughts and storms and decades of prairie wind, and now she was going to cut them down to save a ranch that might fail anyway. But what choice did she have? When do we start? She asked. Tomorrow morning. They spent that evening preparing. Caleb sharpened the saw and axe until they could split hair. Margaret mended their warmest clothes and packed food that would last through long days in the cold. Neither of them talked about the danger, but it hung in the air between them like smoke. That night, Margaret couldn't sleep. She lay in bed listening to the wind and thinking about all the ways this could go wrong. A tree falling the wrong way. An axe slipping. Frostbite. Exhaustion leading to a mistake that cost them everything. Around midnight, she heard footsteps and saw light under her door. She got up, wrapped in a blanket, and found Caleb in the kitchen making coffee. "Couldn't sleep either?" she asked. "No, ma'am." She sat down at the table. "Tell me the truth. Can we actually do this?" Coffee for both of them and sat down across from her. In the lamplight, his face looked older, more worn than when he'd arrived. "Honestly, I don't know. Logging is dangerous work even with a full crew and good weather. Just the two of us in winter." He shook his head. "But I don't see another option. We could give up, sell to Sam, take what we can get, and walk away." "Is that what you want?" Margaret thought about it. Really thought about it. Walking away would be easier, safer. She could start over somewhere else, somewhere that didn't have these memories and debts and desperate gambles. But when she imagined leaving, all she felt was hollow. "No," she said quietly. "I don't want to give up." "Then we don't. Even if it kills us?" "We all die eventually, Mrs. Mercer. Might as well die fighting for something that matters." She looked at him across the table, this stranger who'd become her husband, her partner, her… what? Friend seemed too small a word for what they'd become to each other. "When did you get so philosophical?" she asked. "I've got hidden depths." Apparently. They drank their coffee in comfortable silence. Outside, the wind howled like something wild and wounded. Inside, the fire crackled, and two people who'd started as desperate strangers sat together and planned how to cut down trees in the freezing cold to save a ranch that neither of them could bear to lose. When Margaret finally went back to bed, she realized something had shifted between them. The careful distance, the formal addresses, the wall they'd both maintained. It was crumbling. She wasn't sure when it had started. Maybe that first night in the line shack, pressed together on the narrow cot. Maybe during the fence work, when they developed a rhythm that didn't require words. Maybe it had been happening slowly since the day he arrived, brick by brick coming down until what remained was something she didn't quite have a name for yet. All she knew was that when she thought about losing the ranch now, what scared her most wasn't being alone. It was losing him. The first tree came down on a Tuesday morning when the temperature was so cold that spit froze before it hit the ground. Caleb had spent an hour studying the oak, walking around it, examining the lean, checking for dead branches that might fall unexpectedly. Margaret watched him work, her breath coming out in white clouds, hands shoved deep in her coat pockets. "This one first," he finally said, pointing to a tree slightly smaller than the others. "It's leaning northeast already. If we cut it right, it'll fall clean into that clearing. And if we cut it wrong, then it takes out 3 other trees and maybe us with it." That's comforting. Wasn't trying to be comforting, just honest. They'd borrowed a 2-man crosscut saw from Jack Henderson, promising to return it in one piece. The saw was 7 feet long, wicked sharp, and required both of them working in perfect rhythm to be effective. Caleb marked the cut line with chalk, then they got into position on opposite sides of the trunk. The saw blade bit into wood with a sound like tearing fabric. "Slow and steady," Caleb said. "Don't force it. Let the saw do the work. Push, pull, push, pull." Back and forth in a rhythm that seemed easy until your shoulders started burning and your hands cramped around the handles. The cold made it worse. Every movement felt sluggish. Every breath hurt. They worked for 20 minutes before Caleb called a break. Margaret stepped back, flexing her hands, watching sawdust fall like snow from the cut they'd made. It wasn't even a quarter of the way through the trunk. "How long is this going to take?" she asked. "This tree? Maybe 2 hours total if we're lucky. Then we've got a limit, bucket into sections, and haul it to the wagon. And we have 20 trees to do. 19 after this one." Margaret looked at the grove, doing math she didn't want to do. Even if they could manage 1 tree per day, which seemed optimistic, they'd need 3 weeks. They had 18 days until foreclosure. "We need to go faster," she said. Can't rush this kind of work. Rush it, and someone dies. "Then we work longer days, start earlier, finish later." Caleb studied her face. "You sure about this? We could still… Don't," Margaret cut him off. "Don't give me an out. I'll take it, and I don't want to take it." He nodded slowly. "All right then, let's keep cutting." They went back to the saw. Push, pull, push, pull. Margaret's world narrowed to the rhythm, the bite of metal in wood, the burn in her muscles. Somewhere around the 1-hour mark, her hands started bleeding through her gloves. She didn't mention it. Finally, Caleb pulled back. "That's deep enough," Stand clear. He grabbed the axe and started chopping the remaining wood on the opposite side of the trunk, creating a wedge that would guide the fall. 3 solid strikes, and the tree groaned, a sound like the earth itself complaining. "Move!" Caleb shouted. They both scrambled back as the oak tilted, slowly at first, then faster, crashing down exactly where Caleb had predicted with a boom that shook the ground and sent snow cascading from nearby branches. Margaret stared at the fallen giant, her heart hammering. 1 down. 19 to go. The work became a brutal routine. Wake in darkness, eat whatever cold food was quickest. Walk to the grove. Cut, limb, buck, haul. Repeat until darkness made it too dangerous to continue. Stumble home, eat again, collapse into bed. Do it all again the next day. Their hands became hamburger despite gloves. Margaret's palms split open and bled, then scabbed over, then split open again. Caleb developed a cough that rattled in his chest but refused to stop working long enough to recover. They were both losing weight they couldn't afford to lose, burning through calories faster than they could replace them. On the 4th day, disaster nearly struck. They were working on a particularly large ash tree when a gust of wind hit mid-fall. The tree twisted as it came down, branches catching in neighboring oaks, the whole mass of wood swinging sideways like a pendulum. "Run!" Caleb grabbed Margaret and shoved her forward. They dove behind a thick oak trunk as the falling ash crashed down where they'd been standing seconds before. Branches exploded on impact, sending debris flying. Something sharp caught Margaret across the cheek, opening a cut that bled hot down her face. They sat there in the snow, breathing hard, while death settled into stillness around them. "You all right?" Caleb asked, his voice shaking slightly. Margaret touched her cheek, felt blood. "Yeah. You?" "Yeah." They looked at each other and suddenly Margaret started laughing. Not funny laughing, but the kind of laughter that comes when you've just escaped something terrible and your body doesn't know how else to process it. "We almost died," she said between laughs. "We almost got killed by a damn tree." "Still might," Caleb said, but he was smiling too, that rare expression that made him look younger. "We've got 15 more of these bastards to cut. Then we better get back to work." But that night, when they returned to the ranch, Caleb made her sit still while he cleaned the cut on her face and bandaged it with strips torn from an old shirt. "Hold still," he said, his fingers gentle despite being rough and calloused. "It's just a scratch. It's deep. Could get infected if we don't keep it clean." His face was very close to hers, close enough that she could see the gray in his beard, the fine lines around his eyes, the way his jaw clenched when he concentrated. Close enough that she could smell sawdust and sweat and something underneath that was just him. "There," he said, tying off the bandage. "That should hold." "Thank you." Their eyes met, and for a moment neither of them moved. The air between them felt charged somehow, heavy with something Margaret didn't want to name because naming it would make it real, and real things could hurt you. Caleb pulled back first, standing up, putting distance between them. "Get some rest," he said gruffly. "Tomorrow's going to be another long one." He disappeared into his room before Margaret could respond, leaving her sitting there with her hand pressed to the bandage and her chest feeling tight. By the 8th day, they'd felled 12 trees. The work was getting harder, not easier. Their bodies were breaking down faster than they could recover. Margaret had developed a limp from a twisted ankle. Caleb's cough had gotten worse, deep and wet-sounding, but they kept going because stopping wasn't an option. That evening, while they were hauling sections of oak to the wagon, one of the cattle started bellowing from the barn. Not the normal sound, something panicked, distressed. Margaret and Caleb looked at each other and ran. Inside the barn, they found one of the cows down on her side, breathing in labored gasps. She was one of the older animals, already weak from the hard winter. Now she was dying. "Damn it," Margaret whispered, kneeling beside the cow. "Not now. Please, not now." Caleb checked the animal quickly, his hands moving with surprising gentleness. "She's sick. Has been for a while by the look of it. Could be pneumonia, could be something else. Can we save her?" "Maybe. If we had medicine, warm shelter, time to nurse her back." He looked at Margaret. "We don't have any of those things. So we just let her die?" "I didn't say that." He stood up, headed for the door. "I'll ride to town. See if Doc Brennan has anything that might help. You stay with her, keep her warm as you can. Caleb, it's almost dark. I know what time it is. He rode out on the old mare before Margaret could argue further, leaving her alone in the barn with a dying cow and a lantern that was running out of oil. She sat down in the straw, pulled the cow's head into her lap, and waited. The cow's breathing was rough, rattling. Each inhale sounded like it might be the last. Margaret stroked the animal's neck, feeling ribs too prominent under the hide, and felt tears start to track down her face. She was crying over a cow. After everything, Thomas's death, the debts, the desperate marriage, the brutal work, it was a dying cow that finally broke her. Or maybe it wasn't the cow at all. Maybe it was everything. The weight of 8 months of fighting, of pretending she was strong enough to handle this, of pushing down every feeling because feelings were a luxury she couldn't afford. "I'm so tired," she whispered to the cow, to the empty barn, to no one. "I don't know how much more I can do." The cow just breathed, in and out, stubbornly clinging to life. Caleb returned 2 hours later with medicine and grim determination. Doc Brennan had given him something for cattle pneumonia, though he'd warned it might not work. Together they dosed the cow, covered her with every blanket they could spare, and kept vigil through the night, taking turns staying awake, monitoring her breathing, hoping for improvement that was slow to come. Around 3 in the morning, during Margaret's watch, Caleb woke up and joined her in the barn without explanation. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked. "Kept thinking about what happens if she dies. That's $200 of cattle value gone. Maybe more." "I know. We're running the numbers too close, Margaret. One disaster and we're done." "Then we better hope we don't have any disasters." He laughed, a tired sound. "Little late for that." They sat in silence for a while, watching the cow breathe. Then Caleb spoke again, his voice quiet in the darkness. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." "Why are you fighting so hard for this place? It's not just the money or the land. There's something else." Margaret considered the question. She could give him the easy answer, that it was her home, her inheritance, her responsibility. But they were past easy answers now. "After Thomas died, everyone expected me to fail," she said slowly. "Not just expected, they wanted me to fail. So they could shake their heads and say, 'Poor Margaret, she tried, but a woman can't run a ranch alone.' Like my failure would prove something about all women, not just me. That's a lot of weight to carry." "Yeah, but more than that." She paused, searching for words. "This ranch is the only thing I've ever had that's really mine. Thomas inherited it from his father, but he's gone and his father's gone and now it's mine. Not because someone gave it to me or because I married into it. It's mine because I'm the one still standing, the one still fighting. And if I let them take it, if I just give up..." She shook her head. "Then what was it all for? What was any of it for?" Caleb was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "It's not just yours anymore, you know. It's ours. The marriage certificate is just paper, Caleb. You don't have to..." "I'm not talking about the paper. I'm talking about the work, the fences we built, the trees we're cutting, the jobs we took. That's real. That makes it ours." Margaret looked at him in the dim lantern light. "You really believe that?" "Yeah, I do." "Why? What's this place to you? You could walk away tomorrow and find work anywhere." "I could," he admitted, "but I don't want to. This is the first place I felt like I belonged in years, maybe ever. And you..." He stopped, seeming to struggle with something. "You're the first person who's treated me like a partner instead of hired muscle or a problem to manage." "Is that what this is? Partnership? Isn't it?" The question hung between them, heavy with implications neither of them seemed ready to address directly. Before Margaret could answer, the cow took a sudden deeper breath and shifted slightly. They both turned to look. "Is that a good sign?" Margaret asked. "Maybe. We'll know by morning." They sat together until dawn, not talking much, just being present in the cold barn with the sick animal and each other. And when morning came and the cow was still breathing, still alive, it felt like a small victory in a war they were losing inches at a time. The logging continued. Day after brutal day, they cut and hauled and stacked until Margaret's dreams were full of falling trees and the rasp of saws. By day 15, they'd processed 18 trees and hauled 3 wagon loads to the lumber mill in town. The mill foreman, a squat man named Gus Talbot, examined their timber with a critical eye and made offers that seemed designed to insult. $100 for the lot, he said, pointing at the first wagon load. "That's half what it's worth," Caleb said flatly. "Take it or leave it. Winter timber's always cheaper. You know that." Winter timber's harder to harvest. Should cost more, not less. Gus shrugged. Supply and demand. I got no demand right now. They argued for 20 minutes before settling on 140. It was still less than the wood was worth, but time was running out and they couldn't afford to shop around. The second and third loads went similarly. By the time they'd sold everything, they had just under $400 from the timber. Combined with what they'd saved from other work, they now had $617 total. Margaret counted it 3 times in the kitchen, laying bills out on the table, making sure she hadn't miscounted. $617, she said. We need $1,500. That's, $883 short, Caleb finished. And we've got 10 days left. The numbers felt crushing. After all the work, all the pain, all the near-death experiences with falling trees, they were still so far from their goal. We're not going to make it, Margaret said, and hearing the words out loud made them real in a way they hadn't been before. We can't earn that much in 10 days. It's impossible. Caleb stared at the money spread across the table. His face was gaunt from weeks of brutal work, the cough still rattling in his chest, his hands bandaged from the constant saw work. Maybe not, he said quietly, but we're closer than we were. And we still have time. Not enough time. Then we work smarter. What else do we have that's worth money? Margaret looked around the kitchen. They'd already sold everything valuable. The furniture that remained was junk. The tools were necessary for work. The cattle were rebuilding assets they couldn't afford to liquidate. Nothing, she said. We have nothing left. There's got to be something. There isn't, Caleb. We've sold everything, worked ourselves half to death, and it's still not enough. Maybe it's time to face reality. Maybe we've lost. No. His voice was hard, certain. We haven't lost until the bank takes the deed. Until then, we keep fighting. Fighting for what? So we can be $800 in debt instead of $1,500? That's not winning. That's just delaying the inevitable. Maybe, but I'd rather go down swinging than give up before the final bell. Margaret wanted to scream. She wanted to throw something. She wanted to tell him that blind determination wasn't the same as a plan, that hope wasn't currency, that they were drowning and he was refusing to see it. But looking at his face, stubborn, worn, but somehow still certain, she couldn't bring herself to say any of it. Fine, she said instead. We keep fighting, but I don't know what we're fighting with anymore. That night, Margaret couldn't sleep again. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to Caleb cough in the next room, and felt despair settling into her bones like winter cold. They'd done everything right, worked harder than should have been humanly possible, made sacrifices, taken risks, earned money the brutal way. And it still wasn't enough. Around midnight, she heard Caleb moving around in the kitchen. Curiosity got her out of bed, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders as she went to investigate. He was at the table with all their papers spread out, ledgers, receipts, the loan documents, everything. His hair was wild from running his hands through it, and he looked like a man trying to solve a puzzle that had no solution. Can't sleep either? She asked. He looked up, startled. Didn't mean to wake you. You didn't. I was already awake. She sat down across from him. What are you doing? Looking for something we missed, some expense we can cut, some asset we haven't considered, He gestured helplessly at the papers. Something. Margaret felt her chest tighten with affection for this man who refused to quit, even when quitting was the only sensible option. Caleb, she said gently, sometimes things don't work out. Sometimes you do everything right and still lose. I know that. Then why are you still fighting? He was quiet for a moment, staring at the papers. When he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. Because when I showed up here, I had nothing. One bag, some patched clothes, and a future that looked like more of the same drifting I'd been doing for years. You took a chance on me when you had no reason to. Married me when it would have been safer to face this alone. And in these past weeks, working beside you, building something together, it's the first time I felt like my life meant something beyond just surviving day to day. He looked up at her, and in his eyes she saw everything he wasn't saying. I'm not fighting for the ranch anymore, Margaret. I'm fighting for us, for this partnership, this team we've become. I'm fighting because losing you, losing this, would hurt worse than losing any piece of land. The words hit her like a physical force, because somewhere along the way, between fence posts and falling trees and frozen nights in line shacks, she'd stopped fighting for the ranch too. She was fighting for him. "Caleb," she started, but didn't know how to finish. He stood up abruptly, like he'd said too much and needed to retreat. "I should let you sleep. We've got more work tomorrow." But Margaret stood too, moved around the table before he could disappear into his room. She didn't think. She just acted. Reached up, pulled his face down to hers, and kissed him. For a second, he froze. Then his arms came around her, pulling her close, and he was kissing her back like a drowning man finding air. It wasn't gentle or romantic. It was desperate and fierce, and tasted like coffee and exhaustion and months of carefully maintained distance finally crumbling. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, Margaret kept her hands on his chest, feeling his heart hammering under her palms. "I was wrong," she said. "Earlier, when you asked if this was partnership. It's more than that. It's been more than that for a while now, and I've been too scared to admit it." "Scared of what?" "Of losing you if the ranch fails. Of caring about someone again after Thomas. Of—" She stopped, forced herself to be honest. "Of feeling something real and having it taken away." Caleb's hands came up to frame her face, gentle, despite being rough and scarred from work. "I'm not going anywhere, Margaret. Ranch or no ranch, I'm staying. If we lose this place, we'll find another one. We'll start over. But I'm not leaving you. You promise?" "I promise." She kissed him again, softer this time. And when they finally pulled apart, some fundamental thing between them had shifted. The business arrangement was gone. The careful formality was gone. What remained was just two people who'd found each other in desperate circumstances and discovered something neither of them had been looking for. That night, Margaret didn't sleep in her room and Caleb didn't sleep in his. They stayed together in the bed that had been Thomas's and was now just hers, wrapped around each other under blankets that barely kept out the cold, talking in whispers about everything and nothing until exhaustion finally pulled them under. And for the first time since Thomas died, Margaret didn't feel alone in the darkness. The next morning brought unexpected news. They were eating breakfast, real breakfast, eggs and bacon they'd splurged on because surviving on bread and beans was grinding them down, when they heard a wagon approaching. Caleb looked out the window and frowned. "Someone's coming." "Two wagons, actually." Margaret joined him at the window. Sure enough, two wagons were rolling toward the house, both loaded with supplies and driven by familiar faces. Dutch Werner on the first, Billy Sutton on the second. They went outside to meet them, confused and wary. "Morning," Dutch called out, climbing down from his wagon. "Hope you don't mind us dropping by." "Is there a problem with the fence work?" Caleb asked. "Problem? Hell no. Best fencing I've seen in 20 years. Dutch gestured to the wagons. "We heard through the grapevine that you two are in a bind. Bank foreclosure coming up, not enough money to cover it." Margaret felt her face heat. "That's our business." "It is," Dutch agreed. "But the way we see it, you helped us out when we needed it. Fixed our fences, did good work for fair prices, never cut corners. That counts for something." Billy hopped down from the second wagon. "Talk to some of the other ranchers you've worked for. We took up a collection, nothing fancy, just people kicking in what they could spare." He held out a leather pouch, and when Margaret took it, she could feel the weight of coins inside. "How much?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. $160, give or take. Some folks gave more, some gave less. It's what we could pull together on short notice. Margaret stared at the pouch, then at the two men standing in her yard, looking embarrassed and proud at the same time. Her throat felt too tight to speak. Caleb found his voice first. That's incredibly generous, but we can't accept charity." "It's not charity," Dutch interrupted. "It's neighbors helping neighbors. You'd do the same for any of us if positions were reversed. Besides, whole county's been watching Sam Pritchard circle you like a vulture. Most of us don't like it. Man gets rich enough, he starts thinking he deserves everything he can grab. Good to see someone stand up to him for once." "Also," Billy added with a grin, "the wife made me promise to tell you that if you lose this ranch to that snake Pritchard, she's going to be real disappointed. She's been following your story like it's a dime novel." Despite everything, Margaret laughed. It came out choked and wet, but it was real. "Thank you," she managed. "Both of you. This means more than you know. Don't mention it. Just win this fight, all right? Hate to see good people lose to bad ones." After they left, Margaret and Caleb stood in the yard holding a leather pouch that contained more kindness than money, though the money mattered too. Inside the house, they added it to their total. 617 became 777. We're still over 100 short, Margaret said, staring at the money. 7 days left, and we need $123 more. But for the first time, that gap didn't feel insurmountable. Not impossible, just difficult. And difficult, they could handle. Over the next 5 days, they took every job offered and worked like people possessed. Caleb did emergency blacksmithing for a rancher whose equipment broke during calving season, $30. Margaret did a rush sewing job for the hotel, repairing curtains and linens, $15. They sold the last of their processed timber, $28. Every night they counted. 777 became 842. 842 became 895. 895 became 930. With 3 days left, they were still $70 short. That's when opportunity arrived in an unexpected form. Jack Henderson found them working at the ranch and made an offer. Got a rush job. Freight wagon company needs 20 horseshoes by tomorrow morning. Their regular smith is laid up with a broken arm. It's overtime work, difficult timeline, but I'll pay $25 if you can pull it off. I'll do it, Caleb said immediately. It's overnight work. You'd have to start now and finish by dawn. I'll do it, Caleb repeated. That night, while Caleb worked the forge in town, Margaret couldn't settle. She paced the house, cleaned things that didn't need cleaning, and eventually gave up and rode into town herself. She found him in Henderson's forge, stripped to his shirt sleeves despite the cold, face lit by fire glow, hammering horseshoes with methodical precision. He'd already finished 10, had 10 more to go. What are you doing here, Sid? He asked when he noticed her. Couldn't sleep. Thought I'd keep you company. I'm going to be here all night. Then I'll be here all night too. She stayed, watching him work, occasionally helping when he needed it. They didn't talk much. He was too focused on the task and she didn't want to distract him. But there was comfort in the companionship, in not facing the long night alone. He finished the last horseshoe just as dawn broke, and they delivered them together to the freight company warehouse. The foreman inspected each one, nodded approval, and counted out $25. 930 became 955. With 2 days left, they picked up every odd job they could find. Margaret cleaned the church for $3. Caleb repaired a broken wagon wheel for $5. They sold Margaret's good winter coat, the one she'd been saving, for $12. 970 became 985. The night before the deadline, they sat at the kitchen table and counted everything one final time. $985. They needed $1,500. They were $515 short. After everything, all the work, all the sacrifice, all the help from neighbors, they'd come up $500 short. Margaret felt something break inside her chest. Not dramatically, just a quiet crack, like ice giving way under too much weight. We lost, she said, and the words felt final, real, true. Caleb stared at the money spread across the table. His face was drawn, exhausted, defeated in a way she'd never seen before. Yeah, he said quietly. I guess we did. They sat in silence, looking at $985 that represented months of brutal work and wasn't nearly enough. Tomorrow, they'd go to the bank. They'd hand over what they had, and then they'd lose the ranch anyway. Margaret barely slept that night. She lay in bed listening to Caleb's breathing beside her, feeling the warmth of him against her back, and tried to memorize the feeling. Tomorrow they'd lose the ranch, and after that, nothing was certain. He'd promised he wouldn't leave, but promises made in the heat of the moment were easy. Living them was harder. Around 4 in the morning, she gave up on sleep and went to the kitchen, made coffee with the last of their grounds, and sat at the table watching the sky lighten through the window. Caleb found her there an hour later, already dressed, staring into her empty cup like it might hold answers. Hey, he said softly, sitting down across from her. You okay? No, but I will be. Eventually. We could still run. Take the money and leave before the bank opens. Start over somewhere else. Margaret looked at him. Is that what you want? I want whatever keeps us together. If that means running, we run. She reached across the table and took his hand, feeling the calluses and scars from months of brutal work. No, we face this. We go to the bank, we pay what we have, and we see what happens. Maybe Grayson will give us more time. Maybe he won't. Probably not. but we try anyway. They rode into Red Creek at 9 o'clock, the wagon loaded with everything they'd saved. $985 in bills and coins, counted and recounted until Margaret had the numbers memorized. The bank was a brick building on Main Street, imposing in the way that instant money always were. Charles Grayson's office was on the second floor, accessed by stairs that seemed designed to make supplicants feel small. Grayson was waiting for them, seated behind a massive oak desk that probably cost more than their entire ranch. He was in his 50s, well-fed, with the kind of soft hands that had never done real work. "Mrs. Holloway, or is it Mrs. Mercer now?" he said, not standing. "And Mr. Mercer, right on time. I appreciate punctuality." "We have your money," Margaret said, placing the heavy cloth bag on his desk. Grayson's eyebrows rose. "All of it?" "No, but close. $985. The debt is $1,500. "I know what the debt is, but this represents months of work. Surely that counts for something." Grayson opened the bag and began counting, his fingers moving with practiced efficiency. When he finished, he made a note in his ledger and looked up. $985, as stated. That leaves a balance of $515. "We're aware," Caleb said. "We're asking for an extension, another 60 days. We'll pay interest, whatever you need." "I'm afraid that's not possible." "Why not? We've proven we're good for it. We've paid 2/3 of the debt in less than 2 months. The terms were clear, Mr. Mercer. Full payment by today's date. You've failed to meet those terms." Margaret felt anger rising in her chest. "We've worked ourselves to the bone, done everything possible. Doesn't that matter? Your effort is commendable, but effort doesn't pay debts. Money does. So that's it? We lose everything because we're 500 short?" Grayson spread his hands in a gesture of false sympathy. "I don't make the rules, Mrs. Mercer. I merely enforce them. The bank has obligations to its investors. We can't simply forgive debts because the story is sad. This isn't about a sad story. This is about people's lives. And the bank's survival depends on collecting what it's owed. I'm sorry, but foreclosure proceedings will begin immediately. You have 30 days to vacate the property." The words hit like physical blows. 30 days. After everything, they had 30 days before being thrown off their own land. Margaret started to argue further, but Caleb's hand on her arm stopped her. When she looked at him, his expression was carefully blank, but she could see the anger underneath. "Come on," he said quietly. "We're done here." They walked out of the bank into bright morning sunshine that felt like mockery. Margaret made it to the wagon before her legs gave out. She sat down hard on the seat, staring at nothing. "I can't believe it," she said. "After everything, we still lost." Caleb climbed up beside her but didn't take the reins. "Maybe not." "What do you mean? You heard him. Foreclosure starts today." "I heard him, but I also know that foreclosures take time, paperwork, legal proceedings. We've got 30 days before we have to leave. A lot can happen in 30 days. "Like what?" "We can't earn $500 in a month. We barely earned $1,000 in 2 months." "I don't know yet, but I'm not ready to give up." Margaret wanted to scream at him, wanted to tell him that sometimes giving up was the only sane option, that blind determination was just another word for stupidity. But before she could say any of it, a voice called out from across the street. "Margaret! Caleb! Wait a moment." They turned to see Jack Henderson hurrying toward them, his face flushed with exertion. "Thank heaven I caught you," he said, breathing hard. "I heard you were at the bank. Did they—" "We lost the ranch," Margaret said flatly. 30 days to vacate." "Damn, I was afraid of that." Jack looked between them, then seemed to make a decision. "Listen, this might not be the right time, but there's something you should know. Been hearing rumors the past week. Talk about a railroad coming through." "What kind of talk?" Caleb asked. "The specific kind. Company surveyors were spotted east of town marking routes. And word is they're planning a line from Lincoln west toward the Colorado border. A lot of money involved. A lot of interest in land along the proposed route." Margaret felt something cold settle in her stomach. "What does that have to do with us?" "Maybe nothing. But if I were a betting man, I'd say Sam Pritchard's interest in your ranch has something to do with where that railroad line might go." The implications hit her all at once. Sam's constant pressure to buy the ranch. His visits, his offers, the way he'd gotten more aggressive as time went on. You think the railroad's coming through our property? She asked. Can't say for certain, but it would explain a lot, wouldn't it? After Jack left, they sat in the wagon for a long time, not speaking. The morning traffic of Red Creek moved around them. Wagons, horses, people going about their business like the world hadn't just shifted. If the railroad's coming through, Margaret finally said, and Sam knows about it, then he's been trying to steal the land before you found out it was valuable, Caleb finished. Son of a bitch. We can't prove it. No, but we can ask questions, find out what's really going on. They started with the land office, a dusty building that smelled like old paper and defeat. The clerk, a nervous young man named Timothy Walsh, looked terrified when they asked about railroad surveys. I can't discuss ongoing surveys, he said, shuffling papers without looking at them. It's confidential. Even if those surveys affect private property? Caleb asked. Especially then. The railroad companies require discretion during the planning phase. Who requires discretion? Margaret pressed. Who are you protecting? Timothy's hands shook as he organized already organized documents. I'm not protecting anyone. I'm just following policy. Timothy. Margaret softened her voice. I've known you since you were a boy. Your mother used to buy eggs for my husband. Remember? I remember. Then help us. Please. We just lost our ranch. If there's something we should know, something that might explain why powerful men have been circling us like wolves, don't we deserve to understand? Timothy looked at them for a long moment, then glanced toward the door. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. There are survey maps in the back room, filed under pending development. I'm going to step outside for 10 minutes to take my lunch. If someone were to look at those maps while I was gone, I wouldn't know anything about it. He left before they could thank him. Margaret and Caleb found the maps in less than 5 minutes. Large sheets of paper showing proposed railroad routes, marked with surveyor's notes and calculations. And there, drawn in careful ink, was a line that ran directly through the northeast corner of their property. Not just through it. The route was specifically chosen to go through that section, where the land was flattest and the approach from Lincoln was most direct. Whoever controlled that land would be able to negotiate with the railroad company from a position of strength. Sam Pritchard had been trying to steal a fortune, and he'd almost succeeded. We need copies of these maps, Margaret said. Can't take them. Timothy would get in trouble. Then we sketched them, quick. They worked fast, Caleb drawing rough copies while Margaret kept watch. 5 minutes later, they were back outside with the evidence folded in Caleb's coat pocket. The next stop was the newspaper office, where the editor, a sharp-eyed woman named Dorothy Chen, listened to their story with increasing interest. Railroad conspiracy, she said when they finished. Wealthy rancher trying to force foreclosure to steal valuable land. It's a hell of a story. Can you print it? Margaret asked. Can I? Yes. Should I? That's more complicated. Sam Pritchard advertises in my paper. He's friends with half the businessmen in town. If I print this and I'm wrong, I'll be sued into oblivion. You won't be wrong. We have the survey maps. Sketches of survey maps that you obtain through questionable means. Dorothy leaned back in her chair. Look, I believe you, but belief isn't evidence. You need more. Something concrete that ties Pritchard to knowledge of the railroad route. Something that proves he deliberately tried to force you into foreclosure. How do we get that? I don't know. But if you find it, I'll print it. Front page, full story. And if there's justice in this world, it'll destroy him. They left the newspaper office with more questions than answers. The sun was high now, the day half gone, and they were no closer to saving the ranch. We're missing something, Caleb said as they walked back to the wagon. Some piece that connects everything. Like what? Like proof that Sam knew about the railroad before the foreclosure. If we could show he deliberately tried to steal your land, it's still too late. The bank's already started foreclosure proceedings. Maybe, but if we could prove fraud or conspiracy, that's a lot of ifs, Caleb. I know, but it's all we've got. They were climbing into the wagon when a young boy ran up to them, out of breath and excited. Mrs. Mercer! Mrs. Mercer! My pa said to find you. Said it's important. Slow down, Margaret said. Who's your father? Henry Mills. He works at the telegraph office. Said you should come quick. Says he's got something you need to see. The telegraph office was a small building next to the train station. Henry Mills was a thin man with ink-stained fingers and a nervous disposition. When they arrived, he pulled them inside quickly and shut the door. I could lose my job for this, he said without preamble. But what I heard about you two, how hard you've worked, how you almost saved the ranch, it ain't right what's happening. What do you have, Henry? Margaret asked. He pulled out a telegram, hands shaking slightly. This came through 3 days ago, from Lincoln, addressed to Sam Pritchard. Margaret took the telegram and read it aloud. Route confirmed. Surveyors complete. Purchase Holloway property immediately before announcement. Maximum price $2,000. Urgent. The words hung in the air like indictment. Who sent this? Caleb asked. A Lincoln businessman named Robert Crawford. He's got investments in the railroad company. And according to the records I checked, probably shouldn't have done that either. He and Sam Pritchard have exchanged over a dozen telegrams in the past 2 months. This is it, Margaret breathed. This is proof that Sam knew about the railroad, that he tried to force foreclosure so he could buy the land cheap before we found out. It's a copy, Henry said. The original went to Sam, but copies are kept in our files for 6 months. Standard procedure. Can we have this? Technically, no. Telegrams are private correspondence. But if someone were to ask me about it officially, say a lawyer or a sheriff, I'd have to produce it. Margaret looked at Caleb. We need a lawyer. Do we even have a lawyer in Red Creek? Not a full-time one, but Roger Fleming handles legal work sometimes. Used to practice in Lincoln before he retired out here. They found Roger Fleming in his house on the edge of town, a small cottage surrounded by a garden that was dormant for winter. Fleming himself was in his 70s, white-haired and sharp-eyed, and he listened to their story with the intensity of someone who'd been bored for too long. So let me make sure I understand, he said when they finished. You have survey maps showing a railroad through your property. You have a telegram proving Sam Pritchard knew about it, and the bank foreclosed on you this morning despite you paying 2/3 of the debt in record time. That's about the size of it, Caleb said. And you want me to do what exactly? The foreclosure is legal, even if the motivation behind it was corrupt. Can't you stop it? Margaret asked. File an injunction or something? On what grounds? That Sam Pritchard is unethical? That's not illegal. That a railroad might come through? That's not the bank's concern. Then what can we do? Fleming was quiet for a moment, tapping his fingers on the arm of his chair. Then he smiled, and it was the smile of a man who'd just seen a loophole. The foreclosure is legal, he said, but that doesn't mean we can't make it very expensive for everyone involved. If I were to file a lawsuit claiming conspiracy to defraud, claiming that the bank and Pritchard colluded to force you off valuable land, that would tie up the foreclosure in court for months, maybe longer. Would we win? Caleb asked. Probably not. That's not the point. The point is delay. During the lawsuit, you'd have the right to remain on the property, and if the railroad announcement becomes public during that time, well, he spread his hands. The bank might suddenly become very interested in renegotiating terms. Margaret felt hope stirring for the first time since leaving Grayson's office. How much would this cost? More than you have, I'd wager. Legal work isn't cheap. We have $985. We can pay— Keep your money, Fleming interrupted. I'm 73 years old. I've got more money than time, and I'm bored as hell. This sounds like fun. Besides, I never liked Sam Pritchard. Arrogant bastard. You do this for free? I do it for the entertainment value. And because sometimes the little guy deserves to win. He stood up, suddenly energized. Give me 2 days to prepare the paperwork. In the meantime, don't talk to anyone about this. And whatever you do, don't leave the property. If you're not in residence, they can claim abandonment. That night, back at the ranch, Margaret and Caleb sat at the kitchen table with Fleming's words ringing in their ears. This could actually work, Margaret said, almost afraid to believe it. It's not over yet. Fleming said probably months. We'd still need to earn that $500 somehow. But we'd have time, but that's more than we had this morning. Caleb reached across the table and took her hand. I need to tell you something. The seriousness in his tone made her stomach clench. What? If this does work, if we save the ranch and the railroad comes through and we suddenly have money, I need you to know that's not why I stayed. That's not why I— He stopped, seemed to struggle with the words. I didn't fall in love with you because of the ranch or what it might be worth. I fell in love with you because of who you are. The way you fight, the way you refuse to quit even when quitting makes sense. I need you to know that. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. I know, and I need you to know the same thing. I didn't fall in love with you because you saved me. I fell in love with you because you stayed when leaving would have been easier, because you worked yourself to the bone for a place that wasn't even yours, because you're good and stubborn and you make terrible coffee, but you make it anyway. He laughed at that, a real laugh that broke some of the tension. My coffee isn't that bad, he protested. It's awful, but I love you anyway. I love you too. They sat there holding hands across the table, and for the first time in months, Margaret felt something like peace. 2 days later, Roger Fleming filed the lawsuit. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Charles Grayson showed up at the ranch personally, red-faced and furious. You can't sue the bank. We followed every legal protocol. Then you have nothing to worry about, Margaret said calmly from the porch, not inviting him inside. This is harassment, abuse of the legal system. This is two people exercising their rights. If you don't like it, talk to your lawyer. Sam Pritchard's reaction was even better. He rode up with his usual entourage, but this time he wasn't smiling. You've made a serious mistake, he said, not bothering with pleasantries. Filing frivolous lawsuits against respected businessmen. This will ruin you. Funny, Caleb said, standing beside Margaret on the porch. We were already ruined. Can't ruin us twice. You think you're clever, but you don't know who you're dealing with. We know exactly who we're dealing with. A man who tried to steal our land because he knew a railroad was coming through. A man who used his influence to pressure the bank into foreclosing early. Sam's face went pale. I don't know what you're talking about. Sure you don't. That's why you sent all those telegrams to Robert Crawford in Lincoln. That's why you've been circling this property for months like a vulture. You can't prove any of that. Actually, Roger Fleming said, stepping out from inside the house where he'd been waiting. They can. I have the telegrams, I have the survey maps, and I have a very interesting story to tell the court about conspiracy to defraud. Should make for compelling testimony. Sam stared at Fleming, then at Margaret and Caleb. For the first time since they'd known him, he looked genuinely worried. You're making a mistake, he said again, but the confidence was gone from his voice. Maybe. But it's our mistake to make. He left without another word, and watching him ride away, Margaret felt something like victory. The lawsuit moved slowly, the way legal things always do. But true to Fleming's prediction, the foreclosure was tied up in court. They had time. And then, 3 weeks later, the railroad announcement became public. It was front-page news in every paper from Lincoln to Denver. The Continental Pacific Railroad was building a new line west, and the route went exactly where the survey maps had shown, right through the Mercer Ranch. Overnight, their property value multiplied. What had been worth maybe $3,000 suddenly became worth $20,000, $30,000, maybe $50,000, depending on how negotiations went. The bank's attitude changed immediately. Grayson showed up at the ranch with a new proposal. The debt would be forgiven entirely if they dropped the lawsuit and didn't pursue damages. No, Margaret said simply. Mrs. Mercer, be reasonable. You had a chance to be reasonable. You chose to foreclose on us instead. Now we're choosing to see this through. You could lose everything in court, or we could win and expose how your bank colluded with Sam Pritchard to steal valuable land from a widow. Think about how that would look in the newspapers. Grayson left, and 2 days later the bank settled. The debt was forgiven. The lawsuit was dropped. And as a gesture of goodwill, the bank paid them $5,000 to prevent any further legal action. $5,000. They'd been fighting over $1,500, and now they had $5,000. The railroad negotiations were handled by Roger Fleming, who developed a taste for the fight and refused to back down until they got terms that were actually fair. In the end, the Continental Pacific Railroad paid them $18,000 for an easement across their property, plus annual rent of $500 as long as the line remained active. $18,000. It was more money than Margaret had seen in her entire life. The first thing they did was pay off every remaining debt. Not that there were many, but Margaret insisted on clearing the books completely. The second thing was to pay Roger Fleming, who accepted a modest fee and nothing more despite his work being worth 10 times that. The third thing was to rebuild the ranch properly. They hired workers to repair the barn roof, fix the foundation, replace worn fencing. They bought cattle to rebuild the herd, good breeding stock that would produce for years. They upgraded equipment, built a proper workshop, even added a room onto the house. And through it all, Margaret and Caleb worked alongside the hired help, because that's who they were. People who'd learned that nothing worth having came easy. The town's attitude toward them changed completely. The whispers about the widow and the stranger became stories about the couple who'd beaten impossible odds. Rachel Morrison actually apologized, in her own backhanded way. Sam Pritchard left town entirely, his reputation destroyed by revelations about his attempted land grab. 6 months after nearly losing everything, the Mercer Ranch was thriving. The cattle were healthy, the fields were productive, and the future looked nothing like the desperate present they'd been living in. One evening, as the sun set over the prairie in shades of gold and red, Margaret and Caleb sat on their porch, a new porch, properly built, with chairs that didn't wobble, and watched the day end. "You ever think about how this all started?" Margaret asked. "Me writing that desperate letter, you answering it." "Sometimes. Feels like a lifetime ago." "It was only 8 months. Longest 8 months of my life." "Mine too." She reached over and took his hand. "But the good kind of long, the kind that matters." "Yeah," Caleb agreed, "the kind that matters." In the distance, a train whistle sounded as the evening freight passed through. The railroad that had nearly destroyed them and had instead made their fortune. Life was strange that way, full of turns you couldn't predict and outcomes that defied logic. "I'm glad you answered my letter," Margaret said. "I'm glad you wrote it. Even though we almost lost everything, we didn't almost lose everything. We almost lost the ranch, but we never came close to losing each other. And that's what really matters." Margaret smiled, squeezed his hand, and watched the sunset paint the prairie in colors that looked like hope. They'd started as strangers bound by desperation. They'd become partners through brutal work. And somewhere along the way, they'd found something neither of them had been looking for, but both of them needed. They'd found home. But peace, Margaret learned, was a fragile thing, especially when powerful men had tasted defeat and weren't finished swallowing it. The first sign of trouble came 3 weeks after the railroad settlement, when Margaret was in town picking up supplies. She noticed men she didn't recognize loitering near the general store, watching her with the kind of attention that made her skin crawl. When she mentioned it to Caleb that evening, he frowned. Saw some unfamiliar faces at the forge, too. City clothes. Asked Jack about them, and he said they showed up yesterday, staying at the hotel. "You think they're connected to Sam?" "Don't know, but I don't like coincidences." The next incident was harder to dismiss. Someone cut the fence on their south boundary overnight, and by morning, 6 head of cattle had wandered off. They found 4 of them by noon, but 2 were simply gone. "Could be drifters," Dutch Werner suggested when they asked him if he'd seen anything. "Or it could be someone sending a message." "What kind of message?" Margaret asked, though she already knew. "The kind that says you made powerful people look bad, and they don't forget." The sabotage escalated. A week later, they discovered their water pump had been deliberately damaged, the mechanism smashed with something heavy. Repairing it cost 3 days and $40 they'd earmarked for other improvements. Then their hay storage caught fire one night. They managed to put it out before it spread to the barn, but they lost half their winter feed in the process. "This is Sam," Margaret said as they stood watching the last of the flames die. "It has to be." "Sam left town," Caleb pointed out. "Everyone saw him go." "That doesn't mean he's not pulling strings. He's got money and connections. Could be paying people to make our lives hell." "Can we prove it?" "No, but I know it's him." Caleb kicked at a piece of charred hay, his face grim. "What do you want to do?" "Fight back, but I don't know how. We can't fight an enemy we can't see." The answer came from an unexpected source. Timothy Walsh from the land office showed up at their ranch one evening, looking nervous and guilty in equal measure. "I shouldn't be here," he said when Margaret invited him inside, "but there's something you need to know." "What is it, Timothy?" "Those men staying at the hotel. I overheard them talking at the saloon last night. They're from Lincoln, associates of Robert Crawford." The name hit Margaret like cold water. Crawford was the businessman who'd been coordinating with Sam Pritchard about the railroad route. "What do they want?" Caleb asked. "They're trying to buy up property near the railroad line, offering good money, but they're also pressuring people, making it clear that refusing might lead to problems." "Like sabotage?" Timothy nodded miserably. "I can't prove it, But the timing seems suspicious. They arrived and suddenly you're having all these accidents. After Timothy left, Margaret and Caleb sat in the kitchen processing this information. Crawford's trying to force us out, Margaret said. The railroad settlement gave us leverage, but he wants that easement controlled by someone he can manipulate. Someone like Sam. Or maybe he wants the whole property, make a killing reselling it to the railroad or developing it himself. Either way, we're in his way. So what do we do? Margaret thought about it. They'd fought the bank and won. They'd fought Sam Pritchard and won. But fighting faceless businessmen from Lincoln with deep pockets and no scruples, that was different. We document everything, she said finally. Every incident, every suspicious person we see, every threat, we build a case. And then? And then we take it to someone who can actually do something about it. The problem was figuring out who that someone was. The local sheriff, a man named Tobias Grant, was competent enough but limited in jurisdiction and resources. Going after wealthy businessmen from Lincoln required more firepower. Roger Fleming had the answer when they consulted him the next day. There's a territorial investigator, he said, leaning back in his chair. Fellow named Marcus Webb. He specializes in fraud and corruption cases. If Crawford and his associates are engaging in criminal intimidation, Webb would be interested. How do we contact him? Caleb asked. I'll send a telegram. But you need to understand something. Men like Crawford don't go down easy. If we're going after him, we need ironclad evidence. Suspicion isn't enough. Then we'll get evidence. Getting evidence proved harder than they'd anticipated. The sabotage continued. Damaged equipment, poisoned cattle feed that made 2 cows sick, more cut fences. But they never caught anyone in the act, never had proof beyond circumstantial timing. Margaret started sleeping poorly again, jerking awake at every sound, convinced someone was out there causing more damage. Caleb took to sleeping with his rifle nearby, and they established a watch rotation to guard the property at night. The strain was wearing on both of them. One night, after another fence was cut, and they'd spent hours in the dark searching for missing cattle, they had their first real fight. We can't keep doing this, Margaret said as they trudged back to the house, exhausted and empty-handed. Living like we're under siege. Maybe we should just sell, take the money and leave. That's what they want, Caleb shot back. You really want to give them the satisfaction? I want to sleep through the night. I want to stop feeling like we're constantly fighting for our lives. We are fighting for our lives. That's what this is. And if we quit now, everything we went through, all the work, all the struggle, it was for nothing. It wasn't for nothing. We proved we could survive. We don't have to prove it again. They stood in the yard, facing each other in the darkness, both breathing hard from emotion and exertion. I'm scared, Margaret finally admitted, her voice breaking. I'm scared they'll hurt you, that they'll burn down the house while we're sleeping, that we'll lose everything we've built, not because we failed, but because someone else won't let us succeed. Caleb's anger deflated. He closed the distance between them and pulled her into his arms. I'm scared too, he said quietly. But we've been scared before and we got through it. We'll get through this. How can you be so sure? Because we're not alone this time. We have allies. We have resources. And we have each other. Margaret pressed her face against his chest, feeling his heartbeat steady and strong. I don't want to lose you. You won't, I promise. It was a promise he couldn't really make, but she took comfort in it anyway. The break they needed came from the most unlikely source, one of Crawford's own men. His name was James Porter, and he showed up at the ranch one afternoon looking haunted and desperate. He was young, maybe 25, with the kind of face that suggested he'd seen more than his years should have allowed. I need to talk to you, he said without preamble, about Crawford and what's been happening. Caleb's hand moved toward his rifle. You're one of his men. I was. Not anymore. Can I come in? They brought him inside cautiously, keeping distance between them. Porter sat at the kitchen table and looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. I was hired 3 months ago, he began. Crawford told me I'd be doing security work for land acquisitions. Made it sound legitimate. But once I got here, I realized what was really happening. The sabotage, the intimidation. It wasn't security. It was criminal. Why should we believe you? Margaret asked. Because I've got proof. He pulled a leather folder from his coat. Records of payments for sabotage. Orders from Crawford detailing what to damage and when. Contracts with local men to cause trouble. Everything. Margaret and Caleb exchanged looks. Why are you giving this to us? Because I didn't sign up to hurt innocent people. And because Crawford's escalating. The fires, the poisoned feed, that was bad enough. But now he's talking about you have an accident, something permanent. The room went cold. He wants us dead? Margaret whispered. He wants you gone, preferably scared off. But if that doesn't work... Porter's jaw tightened. I'm not a good man, Mrs. Mercer. I've done things I'm not proud of. But I'm not a murderer, and I won't stand by while someone else becomes one. Caleb took the folder and started going through it. Page after page of documented corruption, dates, amounts, specific instructions. It was everything they needed. This is enough to destroy him, Caleb said. It is, but you need to move fast. Crawford knows I've been asking questions. He's suspicious. When he realizes these documents are missing, he'll know it was me. What will you do? Margaret asked. Disappear. I've got family in California. I'll head west and hope he doesn't find me. Porter stood up. There's one more thing. Crawford's planning something for tomorrow night. Something big. I don't know details, but I heard him say it would finish the problem permanently. You need to be ready. After Porter left, they sent an urgent telegram to Marcus Webb, the territorial investigator, and another to Sheriff Grant. Then they prepared for whatever was coming. Caleb loaded both rifles and his pistol. Margaret gathered their important papers and the money from the railroad settlement, hiding them in a waterproof bag buried near the barn. They set up watch positions covering all approaches to the house. And they waited. The attack came at midnight. 4 men approached from different directions, carrying torches and kerosene. They weren't subtle about it. This wasn't meant to look like an accident. This was meant to be a message. But Margaret and Caleb had prepared. When the first torch was thrown toward the barn, Caleb fired a warning shot that sent the man scrambling for cover. Margaret rang the bell they'd mounted on the porch, a signal to Dutch Werner and Billy Sutton, who were positioned on the property's perimeter after agreeing to help stand guard. This is private property, Caleb shouted. Leave now or we defend ourselves. The response was another torch, this one aimed at the house. It fell short, but the message was clear. Then Dutch and Billy appeared from the darkness, both armed, both looking like they'd been waiting for this fight. You boys picked the wrong ranch to terrorize, Dutch called out. Drop the torches and leave while you still can. For a moment it could have gone either way. 4 men with torches against 4 defenders with guns. Then the sound of horses approaching made everyone freeze. Sheriff Grant rode up with 3 deputies, all carrying rifles. Nobody move, Grant shouted. Everyone put down your weapons now. The would-be arsonists hesitated, then dropped their torches and raised their hands. It was over in less than a minute. While Grant arrested the 4 men, Margaret noticed a 5th figure watching from a distance, one of Crawford's associates from the hotel. He saw her looking, turned his horse, and rode away quickly. We got the hired hands, Grant said as his deputies loaded the prisoners into a wagon. But the man who hired them is still out there. Not for long, Margaret said. We have evidence. Documents proving Crawford ordered all of this. Then we better move fast. A man like that has resources to run if he knows we're coming. Marcus Webb arrived the next morning on the early train, a stocky man in his 40s with the kind of eyes that missed nothing. He listened to their story, examined Porter's documents, and interviewed the arrested men, who quickly started talking when offered reduced sentences. By noon, he had enough to issue warrants for Robert Crawford and 3 of his associates. By evening, all 4 were in custody. The trial happened 6 weeks later in Lincoln, in a courthouse that smelled like old wood and the weight of consequence. Margaret and Caleb testified about the sabotage, the threats, the attempted arson. Porter testified about Crawford's orders and payment records. The hired men testified about carrying out those orders. The evidence was overwhelming. Crawford tried to fight it, hiring expensive lawyers who argued that he was a legitimate businessman being persecuted by jealous competitors. But the documents didn't lie, and neither did the testimony of a dozen witnesses. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. Guilty on all counts. Crawford was sentenced to 8 years in prison. His associates got shorter sentences, but they were all convicted. And just as importantly, the story became public. Newspapers from Lincoln to Denver covered the trial, painting a picture of wealthy men using intimidation and violence to steal from hardworking people. It destroyed what was left of Sam Pritchard's reputation, too. His connection to Crawford became public knowledge, and though he wasn't charged with crimes, the court of public opinion was less forgiving. Last Margaret heard, he was living in Kansas under a different name, his fortune mostly gone to legal fees and bad investments. Justice, she realized, didn't always come quickly or easily, but sometimes it came. The years that followed were the kind most people dream of, but few actually experience. The ranch prospered not just because of the railroad money, but because Margaret and Caleb knew how to work, how to build, how to turn opportunity into reality. They expanded their cattle operation, buying good breeding stock and hiring hands who worked for fair wages under good conditions. They planted wheat on the western sections where the soil was better suited for crops than grazing. They built proper infrastructure, a new barn, a bunkhouse for workers, a workshop that would have made Jack Henderson jealous. The railroad brought more than just money. It brought growth to Red Creek. New businesses opened to serve the increased traffic. Families moved in to work for the railroad or the businesses it spawned. The town that had been dying slowly suddenly had a future. Margaret and Caleb found themselves at the center of that growth, not because they sought power or influence, but because people respected what they'd survived. When the town council needed advice on business development, they asked the Mercers. When new families arrived and needed guidance about settling in the area, they asked the Mercers. It was strange being looked up to. Margaret still remembered being the widow everyone expected to fail, the woman who'd done something scandalous by advertising for a husband. Now she was Mrs. Mercer, one of the most respected women in the county. But success brought its own complications. Money changed things in ways both good and bad. They could afford luxuries now, store-bought clothes instead of mended hand-me-downs, real coffee instead of the rot-gut substitutes they'd survived on, hired help so they didn't have to work themselves to exhaustion. Yet somehow, those luxuries felt less meaningful than the victories they'd won when they had nothing. One evening, about 2 years after the trial, Margaret found herself standing in the new parlor of their expanded house, surrounded by furniture that actually matched and curtains that weren't threadbare, and feeling strangely empty. Caleb found her there, staring out the window at the prairie beyond. "You all right?" he asked, coming to stand beside her. "Just thinking. About how much has changed. 2 years ago, we were digging post holes in freezing weather and sleeping in a line shack. Now we've got a house with 6 rooms and people who work for us. That's a good thing, isn't it?" "It is. It's just different. Sometimes I miss the simplicity of it, when it was just us against the world." Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You know what I miss? The nights we'd sit at that old kitchen table counting pennies and trying to figure out how to make impossible numbers work. Not because we were poor, but because we were doing it together. Because every penny mattered." "We could go back to that," Margaret said, half joking. "Give away all our money and start over." "No thanks. My back still hurts from cutting down those damn trees." He put his arm around her shoulders. "But I know what you mean. When you're fighting for survival, everything feels significant. Success can feel hollow by comparison. So what do? We find new things that matter, new fights worth fighting." "Like what?" Caleb gestured out the window toward Red Creek in the distance. "Like making sure the growth that's happening is good growth. Like fighting for people who are where we were, desperate and alone and being taken advantage of. Like building something that lasts beyond us." Margaret leaned into him, feeling the solid warmth of his presence. "When did you get so wise?" "I'm not wise. I just pay attention to what matters. And what matters is that we don't waste what we've been given." That conversation led to decisions that shaped the next chapter of their lives. They established a fund to help families in financial crisis, lending money at fair rates or sometimes no rates at all to people genuinely struggling. They fought against predatory business practices in Red Creek, using their influence to push for fair dealing and honest commerce. When a group of investors tried to buy up land around the railroad stop to create a monopoly on development, Margaret and Caleb led the opposition, arguing for open competition and fair access. The fight lasted months, but they won, establishing precedents that protected smaller landowners from being squeezed out. They weren't perfect crusaders. They made mistakes, backed the wrong people occasionally, let their passion override their judgment. But they tried to do right by the community that had helped them when they needed it most. And through it all, their relationship deepened in ways that had nothing to do with the drama of survival. They learned each other's rhythms, the small details that made up a life shared. The way Caleb always made coffee too strong but did it anyway because morning coffee mattered. The way Margaret organized everything but could never find her reading glasses. The way they could work side by side for hours without speaking and somehow communicate everything necessary. 3 years after the trial, Margaret realized she was pregnant. The discovery came. She was 38 years old, had assumed that chapter of life had closed, but the town doctor confirmed it, and suddenly they were preparing for something neither had planned for. "You don't seem happy," Caleb said the night she told him, watching her face carefully. "I'm terrified," she admitted. "I'm too old for this, and I don't know how to be a mother. I barely knew my own mother. She died when I was 12. What if I'm terrible at it?" "Then you'll be terrible at it together with me being terrible at being a father. We'll figure it out the same way we figured out everything else." "By working ourselves to exhaustion and hoping for the best?" "Exactly." Despite her fears, the pregnancy progressed normally. The baby, a boy they named James, after Caleb's father, was born on a spring morning when the prairie was covered in wildflowers and the air smelled like possibility. Holding her son for the first time, Margaret felt something shift in her understanding of the world. She'd fought for the ranch because it represented independence and dignity. She'd fought alongside Caleb because he'd become her partner and her love. But this tiny human who depended on her completely, this was something new. This was fighting for the future instead of just survival. James grew up on the ranch that had nearly killed his parents to save. He learned to ride before he could read, learned to work before he learned to complain about it. But he also grew up with opportunities his parents never had: good education, financial security, a community that supported rather than judged. More children followed. A daughter named Sarah 2 years later, then another son named Thomas, named after Margaret's first husband, because she'd finally made peace with that part of her past. Each child was another stake driven into the ground, another reason the ranch mattered beyond property value or pride. The years rolled on. The railroad became established, then essential. Red Creek grew from a struggling town to a thriving small city. The original pioneers who'd built it aged and were gradually replaced by younger generations who knew the stories but hadn't lived them. Margaret and Caleb aged too. The hard years of brutal labor caught up with them in aching joints and old injuries that hurt when weather changed. Caleb's cough, which had started during those terrible months of tree cutting, never completely went away. Margaret's hands, scarred from fence work and damaged by cold, couldn't grip things as well as they once had. But they were alive. They'd survived, and they'd built something real. On their 20th wedding anniversary, a milestone that seemed impossible when Margaret thought about the desperate letter she'd written to a stranger. They stood together on their porch, watching the sunset paint the prairie gold. Their children were inside arguing about something trivial, their voices carrying through open windows. The ranch stretched out around them, prosperous and solid, a testament to stubborn determination and blind faith that things could work out. "You ever regret it?" Margaret asked. "Answering that letter?" Caleb took her hand, their fingers interlacing naturally after decades of practice. "Not once." "You?" "Not once? Even the terrible parts?" "Especially the terrible parts. They're what made the good parts meaningful." Margaret thought about that. About freezing in line shacks and cutting trees in winter storms and fighting for every penny. About the fear and desperation and moments where failure seemed certain. About how none of it would have mattered if she'd been alone. "I used to think," she said slowly, "that the worst thing that could happen to a person was being alone. After Thomas died, that's what terrified me most. Not poverty or failure, but facing it all by myself. And now? Now I think the worst thing is not being alone. It's being unable to recognize when you're not alone anymore. When you have someone standing beside you and you're too proud or scared to see it." Caleb squeezed her hand. "Good thing you wrote that letter then. Good thing you answered it." The sun slipped below the horizon, leaving behind streaks of red and orange that looked like promises. Inside, one of the children called out asking when dinner would be ready, and the spell of the moment broke. But that was all right. The mundane and the meaningful weren't separate things. They were woven together into the fabric of a life shared, a partnership built not on romance or convenience, but on the simple, difficult choice to keep showing up for each other when everything suggested quitting would be easier. 20 years. 2 decades since Margaret had stood on the edge of ruin and made the desperate gamble that changed everything. 20 years since Caleb had stepped off a train wearing patched clothes and carrying everything he owned in one small bag. They'd built an empire from dust and determination. They'd raised children who would never know the kind of desperation their parents had survived. They'd helped build a community that was better for their presence in it. But more than that, they'd proven something Margaret had stopped believing during those dark months after Thomas's death, that people could find each other in the worst circumstances and build something beautiful from the wreckage. Not perfect. Never perfect. Their ranch still had problems. Their marriage still had arguments. Their children still made mistakes. Life was messy and complicated and full of things that couldn't be fixed with hard work alone. But it was theirs, built together, fought for together, lived together. And that, Margaret thought as she followed Caleb inside to wrangle children and make dinner and do all the ordinary things that made up a life, that was enough. More than enough. It was everything. The story of the widow and the stranger who became partners, then lovers, then legends in their own small corner of Nebraska wasn't the kind of story that got written in history books. It was too small for that, too personal, too specific to one ranch and one couple and one desperate gamble that somehow paid off. But it was the kind of story that got told around dinner tables and passed down through generations. The kind of story that reminded people that sometimes the best things in life came from the worst situations. That desperation could lead to discovery. That strangers could become family. That love didn't always announce itself with fireworks. Sometimes it announced itself with fence posts and falling trees and nights spent counting pennies at a scarred kitchen table. And maybe that was the real lesson in all of it. Not that hard work always paid off, sometimes it didn't. Not that justice always prevailed, sometimes it didn't. Not that love conquered all, it didn't. But that showing up mattered, fighting mattered, choosing to trust someone even when trust felt dangerous mattered. That refusing to quit even when quitting made perfect sense sometimes led to exactly where you needed to be. Margaret Holloway had written a letter asking for a husband because she needed help to save a failing ranch. She'd gotten Caleb Mercer, who'd needed a reason to stop running from life. Together, they'd saved more than just property. They'd saved each other. And if that wasn't worth the struggle, nothing was.